Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to settle, whether you're lying in bed, cooking, driving, or just letting your thoughts slow down. This is your corner for calm, science-based storytelling. Not hype, not speculation, just soft knowledge to carry you through deep time. If you drift off, don't worry. I've left timestamps so you can pick up tomorrow. I'd love to know in the comments when and where you listen. Night, morning, headphones at work. Everyone's rhythm is different, and it's how this community quietly takes shape. If you value this kind of slow learning, liking and subscribing helps more sleepless minds find it too. We don't have every answer, no one does, but we can walk this path together. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Before we even set foot on the trail of human origins, we have to pause at a very odd crossroads. If you spend any time near science classrooms, internet comment sections, or even casual family dinners, you will eventually hear the same question surface. If humans came from apes, why are there still apes? And its cousin, why aren't chimps still evolving into people? It sounds innocent, almost childlike, but buried inside is a misunderstanding so deep that it shapes how most of us imagine evolution itself. It is not just a mistake about biology. It is a way of thinking about time, progress, and what it means to be human. The question persists because the story of evolution has often been told as if it were a ladder. In textbooks, popular magazines, even museum exhibits, we see the iconic March of Progress illustration. A chimp-like creature on the left, then a slightly taller, straighter ape, followed by a hairy caveman, until finally there is us, chest out, upright, modern. The problem is not that these images are entirely wrong. They are simplified visual metaphors of a deep fossil record. The problem is that our brains absorb them as if they were destiny. The ladder implies that the apes we see today are somehow behind us on the same staircase, waiting for their turn to climb into humanity. But evolution does not deal in staircases. It deals in branches. To untangle this, imagine a great oak tree. Its trunk splits again and again into limbs that diverge. No one looks at a branch on the left and asks why it has not become the one on the right. We understand instinctively that both branches are doing exactly what branches do. Growing, adapting, spreading into their own space. Humans and chimps are two branches, not two rungs on a ladder. We both came from a trunk that no longer exists, a shared ancestor that lived somewhere between 5 and 7 million years ago. Asking why chimps are not becoming human is like asking why your cousin is not becoming you. But why does this ladder image survive so stubbornly, despite scientists correcting it for over a century? Part of the answer lies in how our cultures tell stories about progress. The 19th and early 20th centuries were obsessed with hierarchy. Whether in politics, colonialism, or early anthropology, there was a hunger to rank species, cultures, and peoples in a single chain from primitive to advanced. These ideas left heavy fingerprints on the language of science and on public imagination. Even after the science shifted, the pictures and metaphors did not. They were too neat, too satisfying. Humans like a clear finish line. Another reason is psychological. It feels flattering to think of ourselves as the endpoint of a long climb. If chimps are just waiting in line to become us, then we must be the pinnacle, the completed form of nature's great experiment. That gives us a strange comfort, but also blinds us to the truth. Evolution is not progress. It is change under pressure. It has no plan and no final form. A species that adapts to its environment is successful. That is as true for a chimpanzee as it is for a human. This misconception also survives because of the way we learn in childhood. Many of us first meet the idea of evolution in very compressed form. Humans evolved from monkeys. Teachers sometimes rush through it, parents oversimplify, cartoons parody it, and by the time we're old enough to study biology properly, the metaphor has set like cement. Untangling it feels like correcting a deep childhood memory. Even educated adults slip into this language, not because they believe it literally, but because the imagery is sticky. So what do we actually mean when we say humans evolved from apes? The careful answer is that both humans and modern apes evolved from earlier ape-like species. Today's chimpanzees are not ancient holdovers. They are as modern as we are, shaped by the same number of years of evolution, simply down a different path. The chimpanzees of today are not the chimpanzees of 2 million years ago, or even of 50,000 years ago. They too have been changing, adapting, living and dying within their own ecological world. This is where the calm truth sits. Chimps are not becoming us because they are already fully themselves. They have their own story, and their story is ongoing. We happen to find our own tale more fascinating, because it ends with us sitting in front of a glowing screen, asking why chimps are not copying us. But that is our bias talking. In the grand scheme of life, they are no less complete than we are. Let us reveal another layer of this misunderstanding. Many people believe evolution is a straight line that only goes in one direction, upward. In reality, species can become larger, smaller, more complex or simpler, depending on what helps them survive. Cave fish, for example, have lost their eyes over many generations because eyesight was no longer useful in the darkness. Insects, bacteria and plants continue to evolve rapidly, and yet no one asks why they are not becoming human. We ask it of chimps only because they look like us. Their faces, gestures and intelligence are close enough to trigger recognition, and so we imagine them as unfinished versions of ourselves. But think carefully. If a chimpanzee can solve puzzles, use tools, show empathy, pass culture from one generation to another, and survive in its forest home, then it is no less finished than we are. Evolution never promised a species would move toward writing novels or building space telescopes. It only requires that the species keep going. If anything, the fact that chimps have survived in relatively stable, ecological niches for millions of years shows their success. Our own experiment, in contrast, has been running for only a few 100,000 years. No one knows how long we will last. This brings us to the heart of why this question matters. When people ask why chimps are not becoming human, they are really asking what makes us different. Why us, and not them? That curiosity is healthy, but to answer it, we must first discard the ladder in our minds. There is no queue of animals lining up to become people. There is only a branching tree with many species living side by side, some vanishing, others persisting. Humans are just one of those branches. We are unusual, yes, but not the end point. Notice too how often this misconception is used in debates about science and religion, or about the teaching of evolution in schools. The question is sometimes asked not out of curiosity, but as a rhetorical weapon, as if the persistence of chimps disproves human evolution. In that sense, it has become part of culture wars as much as science communication. That makes it even more important to answer clearly and calmly, without arrogance, without mockery. Because for someone genuinely wrestling with the idea of human origins, patience matters. So how do we reframe the question? Perhaps instead of asking why chimps are not becoming us, we might ask what both humans and chimps reveal about the shared ancestor that produced us both. We might ask what environmental pressures split our paths. We might ask how two species, with so many similarities, have written such different histories. Those are real scientific questions, not illusions of a ladder. By now it should be clear that this entire journey begins not with bones in the ground, or genes in a lab, but with our own imagination. The way we picture the story controls the way we understand it. If we keep thinking in ladders, we will never make sense of the branches. If we learn to see the branching, then the fossil record, the DNA, the climate shifts all make more sense. We stop asking why chimps are not becoming us, and start asking something much more profound. Why did we take the paths we did, and what does that say about our place among the living? As we move deeper into this exploration, we will keep circling back to that truth. Chimps are not failed humans, and humans are not perfected chimps. We are cousins. Cousins who left the same ancestral village millions of years ago and took different roads. Our road led to cities, satellites, and bedtime documentaries. Their road led to forests, communities, and survival in a world we would not last a week in. Both roads are remarkable. Perhaps the more haunting thought is not why chimps are not becoming human, but whether humans will manage to remain human in the centuries to come. Evolution has not stopped for us either. We too are still changing, under new pressures we scarcely understand. If the ladder image is misleading, the idea of a final destination is even more so. Evolution does not finish stories. It only writes them, one generation at a time, and so we begin our own story here, not with a fossil, not with a genome, but with a misunderstanding. because only by correcting the question can we start searching for the answers. Another reason this question lingers is that we have built our languages and metaphors around direction. We say we advance, we develop, we progress. We rarely celebrate standing still or adapting sideways. A business is called successful when it grows larger, not when it stabilizes. A student is praised for moving up grades, not for deepening knowledge at the same level. This cultural grammar leaks into our science imagination. We think of every lineage as climbing, improving, and the species that do not look like us appear to have stalled. In truth, they are simply fluent in their own environments. Consider how this same habit shaped early anthropology. For much of the 19th and early 20th century, entire human groups were mislabeled as primitive, as if they too were rungs lower on the same ladder. That way of thinking justified colonial policies and racial hierarchies, because it told a false story of some peoples being closer to chimps and others closer to the civilized endpoint. We now know this was a cultural prejudice, not biology. All humans alive today are equally modern. The same is true of chimps. They are not snapshots of the past, but contemporary species shaped by millions of years of their own history. This misunderstanding also flourishes because chimps resemble us just enough to make the comparison tempting. If you compare us with a starfish or an oak tree, the question never arises. No one says, why aren't starfish becoming human? It is the human-like hands, the eyes, the gestures, the ability to use tools and pass cultural habits that make chimps uncanny mirrors. Looking into their faces, we imagine a halfway point, as if they are our apprentices. But that is projection. A chimpanzee does not wake each morning wishing to write poetry or operate a smartphone. It wakes needing to find figs, maintain alliances, and navigate its forest. That is its full reality, as complete as our own. Another angle often overlooked is how science itself communicates complexity to the public. Scientists are trained to use cautious, precise language, but when ideas are packaged for classrooms or documentaries, subtlety can vanish. A headline that says "humans evolved from apes" is far easier to write than one that says "humans and modern apes share a common ancestor that lived millions of years ago." Over time, the shorter phrasing settles into public memory, and the longer truth fades. The price of simplicity is distortion. All of this brings us to a more thoughtful way of asking. Instead of asking why chimps are not becoming human, perhaps we should ask why humans became so different from chimps. The shift in wording matters. It frames the story not as a failure of chimps to copy us, but as a mystery about the forces that pulled us apart. That is where the true journey begins, not in ladders or in misplaced metaphors, but in the search for the branching that shaped us. If the first mistake is to picture evolution as a ladder, the second is to imagine the very first rung with perfect clarity. We often say humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor that lived somewhere between 7 and 8 million years ago. It sounds neat, it sounds precise. But then comes the question, who was that ancestor? Where is the fossil? What did it look like? And here science must shrug with humility. We do not know. We may never know. The most important ancestor in our story, the one that links our path to the path of chimps, is a shadow. The reason is partly mathematics. The deeper you go in time, the fewer fossils survive. Rain, heat, soil chemistry, scavengers, shifting rivers. They erase bones faster than they preserve them. If a creature lived 7 million years ago in a tropical forest, the odds that its remains fossilized are vanishingly small. Forests are not kind to bones. Acidic soils, constant rainfall, roots tearing through sediment. They destroy evidence before it can even begin to harden. This is why so much of our record comes not from dense equatorial forests, but from drier rift valleys and lake shores where sedimentation works in our favour. So when we say there was an ancestor, we do not point to a skeleton, we point to a ghost. And yet, in the past few decades, fragments have surfaced that may brush against this ancestor. Not clearly, not in full agreement, but enough to make us squint into the dark. In the desert of Chad, scientists uncovered a skull around 2 decades ago. They named it Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its face is short with a mix of ape-like and human-like features. The opening where the spinal cord enters the skull is positioned in a way that hints at upright posture. Dated to about 7 million years ago, it could be close to the fork between chimps and us. Some call it 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, which in local language means hope of life. But here again, the caution. Many disagree. Some see it not as a human relative at all, but as an early ape outside our direct line. A single skull, battered by time, is not enough to anchor the whole tree. From Kenya, another candidate, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, discovered in the early 2000s. Its fossils include fragments of femurs that suggest the creature walked upright at least part of the time. These bones date to roughly 6 million years ago. Upright walking is one of the key features that separate us from other apes, so the temptation is strong to place 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 near the split. Yet again, arguments unfold. Some researchers insist the bones show habitual bipedalism. Others argue the evidence is thin, that climbing was still central, and that we cannot know how close it stood to the shared ancestor. Then there is Ardipithecus, a genus that lived between 5 and 6 million years ago. One species, Ardipithecus 𝐓𝐾𝐒, is known from Ethiopia and may represent a very early hominin. Its teeth carry a mixture of ape-like and hominin traits. The more famous relative, Ardipithecus ramidus, came slightly later and provides more complete skeletons, but 𝐾𝐒 sits closer to the time we are searching for. Still, certainty escapes us. Each fossil is partial, each interpretation contested. This is the uncomfortable reality of science at these depths of time. We can narrow the window. Genetic studies, comparing mutations across species, suggest the divergence between human and chimpanzee lineages likely happened around 7 million years ago, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little later. Fossils dated to that period become suspects, but suspects are not convicts. They hover in the grey zone. Sahelanthropus, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, Ardipithecus, all may belong to our family or all may sit just outside it. The true ancestor, the one individual whose descendants split into chimps on one side and humans on the other, is gone without a trace. And maybe that should not surprise us. After all, no single fossil can represent a population-level event. The split between lineages was not a moment, not a single mating pair, but a long, drawn-out process across thousands of years. Populations separated, reconnected, and separated again. The ancestral gene pool slowly divided until enough differences accumulated that two lineages were walking paths they would never again share. To expect a single fossil to capture that moment is to misunderstand the nature of speciation. Still, the search is not futile. Each fragment gives us hints. Sahelanthropus hints that upright posture may have been emerging earlier than once thought. 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿 hints that bipedalism was not a sudden invention, but a gradual shift in body mechanics. Ardipithecus hints that even near the root, creatures lived in mixed habitats, part forest, part woodland, adapting to new diets and new movements. Each piece sharpens our imagination of what the common ancestor might have looked like, even if we never hold its bones. Why is this mystery so hard for us to accept? Perhaps because as humans we crave origin stories with clear beginnings. We want an Adam or an Eve, a first of our kind. Science does not provide that. Instead, it provides populations, probabilities, and blurred boundaries. The ancestor we share with chimpanzees is not a nameable figure. It is a statistical ghost woven through fragmentary fossils and molecular clocks. Humbling, but also honest. Think about this. Even if we never find the ancestor, its reality is written in our bodies. The fact that humans and chimps share over 98% of our DNA means there must have been such a creature. We do not need the bones to know it lived. We see its echo in the structure of our hands, in the number of our chromosomes, in the arrangement of our teeth. Chimps and humans are too close not to have been siblings once. The absence of a fossil does not erase the certainty of kinship. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this search is that it forces us to practice humility. We live in an age where satellites orbit planets, genomes are sequenced, and artificial intelligence learns at accelerating speed. And yet, when it comes to the most basic question of who stood at the root of our family tree, we are left staring at broken fragments of jaws and worn teeth. The contrast between our technological power and our ignorance of deep origins is striking. But maybe that is the right balance. Science is not a story of omniscience. It is a story of building islands of knowledge in an ocean of uncertainty. When we stand in that ocean, looking back 7 million years, the shorelines blur. We see shapes in the mist. Sahelanthropus in Chad, Orrorin in Kenya, Ardipithecus in Ethiopia. They may be our cousins, our ancestors, or our neighbours. We cannot say for sure, but their existence alone proves something important, that the world was full of ape-like creatures trying different strategies, living in different habitats, experimenting with different forms of movement and diet. Out of that diversity, some lineages vanished, others persisted. One gave rise to chimpanzees, another gave rise to us. So who was the common ancestor we will never meet? Perhaps a creature with the posture leaning between quadrupedal and bipedal, with teeth adapted to both fruit and tougher foods, living in a habitat of patchy woodland and grass. Perhaps a creature that climbed trees for safety, but ventured onto the ground to forage. Perhaps something with a face not entirely chimp-like and not entirely human-like, but somewhere in between. We cannot know the details, but we know enough to sketch a silhouette, and maybe that is enough. Because the deeper truth is that we do not need to meet this ancestor to understand what it means. The message is that our story and the story of chimps are entwined, that we are not an isolated miracle, but part of a branching bush of experiments, that our roots lie not in destiny, but in chance separations and fragile adaptations, and that the figure we imagine at the fork is not a missing link waiting to be filled, but a reminder that some questions remain unanswered, perhaps forever. Which leads us to pause with one last thought. What would it even mean to find this ancestor? If tomorrow a perfect skeleton were unearthed, would it end debates or simply begin new ones? Would it satisfy our hunger for origins, or would it raise new questions about why that lineage went this way and not that? In the end, the search for the ancestor is less about finding a face in the rocks than about learning to live with the space it left behind. There is another puzzle folded inside this search. Even if we accept that the ancestor lived somewhere around 7 million years ago, where exactly on the map should we place it? Fossils like Sahelanthropus come from Chad, Orrorin from Kenya, Ardipithecus from Ethiopia. That spread is vast. Each site today is separated by deserts, mountains, and long stretches of savanna. But 7 million years ago, the landscape was different. Forests stretched wider, lakes came and went, rift valleys opened. The common ancestor may not have lived in one spot, but across a broad range, with populations scattered and mixing, like patches of light across the continent. If so, it would be misleading to search for a single Eden. Our ancestor may not have had a home so much as a shifting territory, fragmented and joined again by changing climate. Trying to reconstruct behaviour from these fossils is even harder. A femur can hint at walking style, but it cannot show how often the animal climbed or how it carried food. A tooth can reveal diet, but it cannot tell us about social bonds. To fill these gaps, scientists often use comparisons with modern apes. For instance, by studying how chimpanzees split their time between trees and ground, or how gorillas forage in patchy woodlands, we gain analogies. But analogies are not evidence. The ancestor might have lived in a way that resembles no living species. It is easy to forget that the world then held many apes we no longer see. To imagine the ancestor only through the lens of modern chimps is to risk squeezing it into a mould that may not fit. This is why fieldwork matters so much. Each new excavation in Central Africa, each survey of old sediment beds, has the chance to turn the story. In the 1990s, no one expected a skull from Chad to push back the human lineage so far west. In the early 2000s, Orrorin surprised researchers by showing upright traits in bones older than many had assumed possible. Each discovery is disruptive, not confirming, which means we cannot predict where the next ghost might surface. A riverbank in Cameroon, a dried lake in Uganda, or a cliff in Eritrea may one day offer fragments that redraw the tree yet again. This uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the very texture of paleoanthropology. Unlike physics, where equations yield neat predictions, or chemistry, where reactions are replicable, human origins are pieced together from scraps that time has spared. That fragility should remind us to treat our stories with humility. When we say the ancestor looked like this, we're really saying, as far as we know, given what little we have. And that humility, paradoxically, is what gives the field its strength. It resists dogma. It lives in openness. So perhaps the most valuable gift of this missing ancestor is not its bones, but its absence. The gap forces us to admit that knowledge is partial. It forces us to compare, to debate, to imagine responsibly. And it forces us to hold two truths at once, that humans and chimps are connected by undeniable kinship, and that the exact face of that kinship remains beyond our grasp. Somewhere in those vanished forests of Africa, an ape walked, climbed, and lived its life, never knowing that millions of years later two of its descendants would sit here, one with fur in the canopy, one with headphones by a glowing screen, both still asking what it all meant. What if the real fork between us and chimpanzees was not about intelligence, or even about anatomy, but about the trees themselves? Picture Africa between 7 and 5 million years ago. Much of it was still forest, rich with fruit, vines and shade. Apes thrived in this canopy world, adapted to climbing, swinging and feeding high above the ground. But the planet itself was shifting. Beneath the feet of those apes, the earth was tearing open. A great scar was forming across eastern Africa, the East African Rift. And with it came the slow collapse of forests into broken mosaics of woodland, grassland and dry savanna. This was not a single event, but a process, driven by tectonics and climate working together. The African continent was stretching apart. The rift tore valleys and raised mountains. Lakes pooled in basins, altering rainfall. As the landscape changed, so did the climate. Wet forests gave way to patchier habitats, with trees scattered and open ground between them. For an ape whose life depended on continuous canopy, this was a crisis. Do you stay in the shrinking forests, competing with others for dwindling fruit, or do you risk the ground, where new dangers wait but also new opportunities? This is where the idea of a mosaic habitat becomes crucial. Instead of endless jungle or endless grassland, the world in which our ancestors lived was fragmented. Pockets of trees, stretches of shrubs, patches of open grass. Each day might involve climbing for figs, walking across open space for tubers, or digging for roots. It was a demanding environment that forced flexibility, and it is here that some researchers argue the Great Divergence began. One lineage of apes remained more closely tied to the forest canopy, ancestors of modern chimpanzees and gorillas. Another lineage ventured more onto the ground, experimenting with upright walking, testing diets beyond fruit, and slowly moving into the evolutionary experiments that would one day produce us. Evidence for these environmental changes comes from geology and paleobotany. The Rift Valley provides layers of sediments that record ancient soils, fossilized pollen, and the chemical fingerprints of past vegetation. In these layers, scientists see a story of drying and patchiness. Around 7 million years ago, humid forests began contracting. By 5 million years ago, mixed habitats dominated large parts of eastern Africa. Alongside these changes, fossils of animals adapted to open grasslands begin appearing. Antelopes, horses, and early grazing species. Their presence signals that the environment was no longer uniform forest. There is also chemical evidence locked inside teeth. Fossilized enamel carries carbon isotopes that reflect diet. Apes eating forest fruits leave different signatures than those consuming grasses or sedges. In fossils from this era, scientists see a gradual widening of diets, with some hominin candidates showing adaptations to more varied food sources than typical forest apes. This suggests experimentation with life outside the dense canopy. Not yet permanent, not yet fixed, but testing. It is tempting to imagine that brains or tools set the first sparks of divergence. But the story at this stage seems more grounded. It may have been simple geography and climate, forcing choices that could not be avoided. Stand on the edge of a receding forest, see the grassland stretching before you, and the path is not about ambition but about survival. Walk or die. Adapt or vanish. The ones who risked open ground may have stumbled into evolutionary pressures that reshaped anatomy. Pelvises shifted, feet adapted, spines bent differently. These changes did not happen overnight, but over countless generations nudged by habitat. It is important here to resist the narrative of destiny. Not every group that left the forest became more human-like. Many likely failed. Many lineages probably tested the ground and disappeared, leaving no trace. What we see in fossils are the survivors of a larger experiment, not the whole picture. Evolution, after all, does not follow a plan. It is a sieve, filtering populations through changing environments. Forest contraction was one such filter, and it seems to have pressed apes into divergent strategies. Chimps clung to trees, our ancestors stepped down. The East African Rift was not just background scenery, it was an engine. As tectonic plates pulled apart, volcanism reshaped the land. High ridges altered rainfall patterns, creating rain shadows that dried some regions while leaving others wetter. Lakes formed, sometimes vast, sometimes shallow, sometimes vanishing altogether. For apes, this meant constant flux. Habitats changed within the lifetime of a single group. What was forest in one generation could be woodland in the next. Adaptability became the key trait. Those less able to cope with uncertainty faced extinction. To imagine the daily life of an ape in this shifting world, think of movement. No longer could you swing through continuous trees. You would climb down, walk awkwardly across an open patch, scan for predators, then climb another cluster of trees. Each crossing exposed you. Each gap demanded new strategies. The ground was not safe. Big cats prowled. Crocodiles lurked near lakes. But fruit trees were no longer enough, so the risk had to be taken. Over thousands of years, bodies that managed these crossings more efficiently may have been favoured. This environmental framing also explains why our story, and that of chimps, diverged while still remaining close. Chimps today are masters of forests. Their anatomy and behaviour are perfect for canopy life. They never needed to leave fully, because forests survived in Central and Western Africa. Their lineage remained tied to that niche. Our ancestors, shaped by rifting landscapes in the East, did not have that luxury. Their forests fragmented earlier, and so they were pushed onto a different path. In this sense, it was not intelligence or foresight that began the split. It was geography, a fault line through a continent, a rearrangement of rainfall, the slow breaking of forests, and yet, we must be careful. These are reconstructions built from patchy data. Climate records from 7 million years ago are not complete. Fossil evidence is uneven. There is always debate over how direct the link is between environment and evolution. Some argue that the story is too neat, that we risk forcing the climate narrative onto fossils without enough proof. Others counter that ignoring climate is equally dangerous. In truth, both anatomy and environment interacted. But the larger point remains. If you want to understand why one branch became human and the other became chimpanzee, you cannot ignore the earth itself restless under their feet. So perhaps the most profound insight from this era is not about individuals or even species, but about the stage on which they lived. The common ancestor we will never meet may have looked like a mosaic ape, part climber, part walker, adapted to a fragmented world. Its descendants split as habitats pulled them in different directions. Some stayed closer to the trees, some drifted further into open ground. Each was simply responding to the cracks of the earth and the drying of forests. That thought leaves us with a strange sense of humility. We often picture human origins as a story of triumph, of brains enlarging and cultures blossoming. But at the very beginning, our path may have been carved by chance geography, by the tilt of plates and the pull of the rift. Not by foresight, not by brilliance, but by necessity. Which raises a quiet question. If the forests had not broken apart, if the rift had not opened, would we even exist? Or would we still be one more ape among the branches, hidden in a forest that never ended? If there is one thing that defines us at first glance, it is the way we move. The straight spine, the swinging arms, the steady rhythm of walking on two legs. These seem so ordinary that we barely notice them. But for most of our evolutionary history, this was not ordinary at all. Walking upright was a risky, awkward experiment. It was clumsy, it hurt, it left us exposed, and yet it is the very trait that set our lineage apart. The real question is not why we became intelligent or why we made tools, but why we stood up in the first place. And when we look closely, the story is less triumphant than we imagine. Standing came crooked first. Between 6 and 4 million years ago, a new kind of ape appeared across eastern Africa. They are grouped together under the name Australopithecus, meaning southern ape. They were small-bodied, with long arms and curved fingers, perfectly capable of climbing. They still had ape-sized brains and ape-like faces, but their legs, pelvis and feet tell a more complicated story. They were experimenting with upright walking, and the experiment was far from perfect. One of the most famous fossils in all of paleoanthropology is a partial skeleton found in Ethiopia in the 1970s. She was nicknamed Lucy, though her official name is Australopithecus afarensis. She lived around 3.2 million years ago, slightly later than the time we are focusing on, but her body preserves the clearest window into this experiment. Her pelvis is short and broad, shaped to support upright posture. Her knee joints lock in ways that allow straight-legged walking, and yet her long arms and curved finger bones reveal she was still at home in the trees. Walking for Lucy and her kind was not the graceful stride we know today. It was mixed, a compromise between tree climbing and ground travel. Even earlier we find hints of this shift in Ardipithecus ramidus, living about 4.4 million years ago. Ardi's pelvis and foot show a mosaic of traits. The pelvis suggests upright posture, but her big toe was still divergent, useful for grasping branches. It is not clear whether she walked on the ground efficiently or awkwardly, but she was not fully adapted to one mode. These fossils suggest that the road to bipedalism was not a sudden leap but a long negotiation between two worlds, the trees above and the ground below. Why make such a compromise at all? Walking upright is not obviously superior. It slows you down compared to a quadruped. It exposes your vital organs. It makes childbirth more difficult because the pelvis must narrow to support the spine. The cost is real, but there are potential advantages. Bipedalism frees the hands for carrying food, infants, or branches. It allows taller posture to scan across grasses for predators or fruit trees. It is also more energy efficient for long-distance travel, once perfected. At first, however, it may simply have been about survival in mosaic habitats, where moving between trees was necessary and standing upright gave small benefits. The fossil record shows this in fascinating detail. The pelvis of Australopithecus afarensis is not identical to ours. It is wider, more flared. This gave stability but also meant walking was less efficient. Their gait would have looked swaying, not smooth. Footprints preserved in volcanic ash at Litoli in Tanzania, dated to 3.6 million years ago, confirm this. The prints show upright walking, but the stride is shorter, the foot placement less refined than in modern humans. It was bipedalism, yes, but not as we know it, and this awkwardness mattered. Bones of Australopithecus show signs of stress, spines bent in ways that suggest strain, knees and ankles carrying loads they were not yet perfected for. Evolution does not design cleanly, it tinkers. The cost of early bipedalism may have been injury and pain, yet it persisted, which means the benefits outweighed the risks. That balance, survival despite cost, is the essence of evolution. What these fossils reveal is that our ancestors were not simply copying some destiny toward humanity. They were improvising, stuck between ecological pressures and anatomical limits. The Rift Valley was opening, forests were breaking apart, and apes were caught in the middle. Some doubled down on climbing. Others, like the Australopiths, leaned into upright walking. They did not know where it would lead, but across generations the experiment became locked into bone. We can reconstruct their bodies, but what about their lives? Imagine a group of Australopithecus moving across a patchy landscape. The adults are small, perhaps 4 feet tall, with curved fingers for climbing and pelvises tilted for standing. They forage for fruit in the trees, then descend to dig roots or carry food back. They walk upright across short stretches, then climb again when danger appears. Children cling to mothers. Predators lurk nearby. Their survival is not a story of dominance, but of precarious adaptation. Upright posture is just one of many tricks in a fragile toolkit. There is also evidence of diversity within these early walkers. Australopithecus anamensis, dating from around 4.2 million years ago in Kenya and Ethiopia, is one of the earliest known members of this group. Its leg bones indicate habitual bipedalism, yet it retained ape-like jaws and powerful chewing teeth. Then came Australopithecus afarensis, with slightly more refined walking but still heavily ape-like traits. These species suggest that upright walking was not a sudden invention, but a spectrum. tested in different ways by different populations. Some species thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, others vanished. The path to us was one branch among many. What is striking is how incomplete this adaptation remained. Unlike tool-making or large brains, which came much later, bipedalism was fixed early, even when it was costly. Once you start reshaping pelvis and feet, there is no easy return to quadrupedalism. The Australopiths committed to upright walking long before it was perfected. This meant that later hominins inherited a flawed design. Many of the back problems and childbirth difficulties we face today are legacies of this compromise. Evolution is not about ideal solutions, it is about good enough to persist. The story of walking crooked first is not one of elegance but of persistence. For nearly 2 million years, Australopiths navigated a middle ground, neither fully ape nor fully human. Their fossils are scattered across eastern and southern Africa, showing wide variation but united by the same experiment: upright posture mixed with climbing. We know them through fragments, skulls, pelvises, leg bones, but together they draw a picture of creatures living between worlds. It is tempting to romanticize this transition as a march forward, but to do so misses the reality. The Australopiths were not on their way to becoming us. They were simply surviving in their time, responding to landscapes that demanded flexibility. Their bodies recorded the compromises, and those compromises eventually laid foundations for our later evolution. But from their perspective, they were not failures or stepping stones. They were successful apes in their own right, lasting millions of years longer than most species ever do. So why did standing upright happen so awkwardly, and what did it cost? It cost stability, safety, and ease. It exposed them to strain and danger, but it opened new pathways, and once those pathways were taken, there was no return. Upright walking was a gamble with the body itself, and the fact that we are here, sitting and listening, means the gamble worked. Yet it leaves us with a sobering thought. If evolution is a series of compromises, then the very thing we take for granted, our steady stride, is not perfection, but patched design. The backaches we nurse, the twisted ankles, the struggles of childbirth, all are echoes of a crooked first step taken millions of years ago by small apes navigating a broken landscape. They did not know what they were starting, they only knew how to survive another day, and that more than destiny is the true root of our walk. By the time we reach 4 million years ago, the experiment of upright walking was no longer new. It had been tested by earlier forms, reshaped, and locked into bone. But what we often forget is that we were not alone in this experiment. Across Africa between 4 and 2 million years ago, there was not one kind of upright ape but many. The human story is usually told as if it were inevitable, as if one lineage naturally outpaced all the others. But the fossil record tells a messier truth. We were just one branch in a crowded field of upright apes. The deeper mystery is not why we succeeded, but why all the others eventually vanished. Australopithecus annamensis, living around 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago, is one of the earliest of these. Its fossils were found in Kenya and Ethiopia. The species shows a blend of traits, jaws and teeth suited for tough foods, but leg bones pointing toward habitual bipedalism. From Annamensis, many researchers think another species emerged, Australopithecus afarensis, the group that gave us Lucy. But afarensis was not the only path forward. Around 3 million years ago, other Australopiths appeared, each experimenting with a slightly different body, diet, and strategy for life. One of the most intriguing is Australopithecus africanus. Discovered first in South Africa in the 1920s, it was one of the earliest fossil species recognised as a possible human relative. Its most famous specimen is the Taung child, a small skull of a young individual with a blend of ape-like and human-like features. Africanus lived between about 3 and 2 million years ago. Its face was shorter and more rounded than afarensis, and its teeth suggest a diet broader than just fruit. The pelvis and leg bones confirm upright walking, though still mixed with climbing ability. In Africanus, we see another version of the same experiment, a small-bodied biped with adaptations to both ground and trees, navigating a varied diet in shifting landscapes. But then comes an even more striking branch, the robust Australopiths, also known as Paranthropus. Around 2.7 million years ago, these creatures emerged in eastern and southern Africa. Their bodies were similar in size to other Australopiths, but their skulls and jaws were extraordinary. They had massive chewing muscles anchored on flared cheekbones, with flat faces and enormous molars. Their dental equipment suggests a diet heavy in tough fibrous foods like roots, tubers or hard seeds. Some researchers even call them nutcracker men. Species like Paranthropus boisei in East Africa and Paranthropus robustus in South Africa thrived for well over 1 million years, a span longer than our own species has yet managed. They were not failed experiments, but highly successful specialists in their time. The presence of these robust forms shows that upright walking was not tied to a single ecological strategy. It was a shared foundation on which very different lifestyles could be built. Africanus was a generalist, eating a wide variety of foods. Paranthropus was a specialist, optimized for heavy chewing. Afarensis held a middle ground spread across eastern Africa. Each lineage shows how flexible bipedalism could be. It was not destiny toward humanity, but a platform that supported diverse ways of being an ape. What unites these species is that none of them were us. For millions of years they lived, adapted and survived, and for millions of years we did not exist. They were the upright apes of their world. From their perspective, they were not on their way to becoming human. They already were complete. We only look back and call them other Australopiths because we are the last survivors, and we write history from the vantage of survival. But their diversity poses a riddle. Why did only one lineage persist while all the others faded? For Paranthropus, specialization may have been both strength and weakness. Their skulls were magnificent tools for chewing, but in times of shifting climate and unstable resources, being tied to a narrow diet may have left them vulnerable. For Africanus, the story is less clear. Generalists usually adapt well, and the species thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. Its eventual disappearance may have been due to competition from other hominins that emerged later, or simply the bad luck of extinction that faces most species sooner or later. The fossil record does not give neat answers, only clues. What it does tell us is that the period from 4 to 2 million years ago was crowded with upright apes. They overlapped in time and sometimes in geography. They were not neatly sequential, like steps in a ladder. They were contemporaries. Picture Africa in this era, and you do not see a lonely figure striding toward destiny. You see multiple species walking upright, each slightly different, each living out its own version of survival. The anatomy of these species also shows that upright walking itself was not identical across lineages. Paranthropus, for example, had postcranial skeletons broadly similar to other Australopiths, but subtle differences may have affected their gait. Africanus seems to have had a slightly more human-like pelvis than Afarensis, hinting at gradual refinement. These details suggest not one path to bipedalism, but multiple variations, all good enough for the environments of the time. Upright walking was not a single invention perfected once. It was a shared adaptation modified again and again. It is worth pausing here to remember the scale of time. From 4 to 2 million years ago is 2 million years of history, almost 10 times longer than all of recorded human civilization. During that expanse, these Australopiths lived, reproduced, and died across landscapes that changed with climate cycles and tectonic shifts. They were not transitional in their own eyes. They were simply the apes of their age. Their disappearance was not immediate but gradual, as new lineages appeared and others dwindled. Extinction is not failure. It is the rule of life. What we can say, with caution, is that their presence set the stage for us. By the time they were gone, the experiment of upright walking was deeply entrenched in multiple lineages. The groundwork was laid for later developments, but we must not confuse groundwork with inevitability. If history had tilted slightly differently, perhaps Paranthropus would have survived and we would not be here. Or perhaps Africanus might have persisted longer and our lineage never emerged. That we are here is not because others were destined to fail, but because chance and circumstance removed them. So were we just one of many upright apes, and why only us survived? The evidence suggests yes, we were one among many, and as for survival, the answer is less about superiority and more about contingency. Climate shifts, ecological pressures, and sheer luck shaped which branches endured. We are not the chosen branch, we are the surviving branch. The Australopiths remind us of that humbling truth, and perhaps the most haunting reflection is that for the vast majority of our evolutionary past, humanity was plural. There was no single form of upright ape, no clear line marching toward us. There were multiple experiments side by side. Today we're alone, but that aloneness is a recent state, a thin layer of time on a much broader canvas. The Australopiths, with their varied faces and bodies, remind us that our uniqueness is not ancient, it is fragile. Two 2.5 million years ago, something sharp split from something dull. The world was already filled with sticks, roots and bones, with apes clever enough to use them. But somewhere in East Africa, for the first time, an ape struck stone against stone with purpose and flakes split off. The result was a jagged edge, crude by later standards but sharper than tooth or claw. It was the first chipped stone. It may not look like much on a museum shelf today, a pebble with scars, but it mattered more than any stick. It was the moment our ancestors discovered that the world around them could be broken and remade. The tools from this time are called Oldowan, named after 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 Gorge in Tanzania where they were first recognised. They appear around 2.6 million years ago, and they represent the earliest widely accepted stone technology. The Oldowan toolkit was simple: cores, flakes, and hammerstones. A core is the rock struck to remove sharp flakes. The flakes are what mattered most: razor-thin pieces of stone perfect for cutting through hide, scraping meat from bone, or breaking into marrow. Hammerstones were used to strike the cores, often round and heavy, chosen for their ability to withstand repeated blows. Together, these few objects marked a leap in behaviour. Why did the first chipped stone matter more than sticks? After all, chimpanzees today use sticks to fish for termites, and capuchin monkeys in South America use stones to crack nuts. But none of these behaviours left a permanent trace. A broken stick rots, a cracked nut disappears. What stone did was change the archaeological record itself. For the first time, behaviour fossilised. Every flake struck 2.5 million years ago could still be lying on the ground today, silent witnesses to the birth of technology. It is this permanence that allows us to reconstruct not just anatomy but thought. The first stone tools are found at sites like Gona in Ethiopia, dating to 2.6 million years ago, and later at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 Gorge and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴 in Kenya. The tools are often found near animal bones marked with cut marks, parallel scratches etched into fossilised bone, proof of slicing meat away. Some bones show percussion marks where stones cracked them open to reach marrow. These traces tell us that stone tools opened resources no other ape could access. A carcass stripped by lions still had scraps of meat clinging to it, and marrow deep within bones. With flakes, early hominins could carve out calories others left behind. This shift mattered for survival. Meat and marrow are calorie-rich, dense with fat and protein. In an environment where food security was never guaranteed, stone tools gave access to a new layer of nutrition. This does not mean our ancestors suddenly became hunters. The evidence suggests scavenging was more likely at first, arriving at carcasses after predators, using flakes to cut what teeth could not. It was not heroic, it was opportunistic. But evolution does not reward glory, it rewards survival. Those who could use stones to scrape even a little extra nourishment may have gained an edge. The question then is, who made these tools? The fossils found near them are fragmentary, but most scholars point to early members of our genus Homo. Homo habilis, meaning handy man, was named precisely because of this association with tools. Discovered in the early 1960s at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 Gorge, habilis had a larger brain than Australopiths, around 600 cubic centimetres on average, and smaller teeth. Its anatomy still looked transitional: long arms, short stature, a mixture of climbing and walking traits. But it is widely seen as one of the first toolmakers. Alongside habilis, another species, Homo rudolfensis, has been proposed, known from fossils at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴 near Lake Turkana. Rudolfensis had a larger face and brain case, though its classification is still debated. Whether these are two species or simply variations of one is unresolved. What matters is that around this time, a new kind of ape was present. one that not only stood upright but struck stone deliberately. They were not yet us, but they had crossed a threshold. Tools had become part of their ecological strategy. From now on, survival was not just a matter of anatomy, but of culture, however rudimentary. It is important to avoid exaggeration. The Old Owen toolkit was not sophisticated. The flakes were crude, often only a few strikes away from the natural shape of the stone. Many were probably made on the spot and discarded quickly. There is little evidence of planning beyond the immediate need. But even this simplicity represented something profound: intentional modification of the environment. A stick used by a chimpanzee to fish termites is chosen, but not reshaped. A stone flake struck by an early Homo was reshaped by intention. That difference, though small in appearance, is large in meaning. Archaeologists debate whether the making of these tools required advanced cognition. Some argue that striking a stone in the right way requires foresight, knowledge of fracture patterns and coordination. Others argue that even simple striking can yield flakes by accident, and that early toolmakers may not have understood mechanics fully. Perhaps it was more like trial and error than design. But in either case, the outcome was the same: sharper edges, more food, new possibilities. The cost of this innovation should not be ignored. Flakes are sharp not just for prey, but for the user. Cuts would have been common, infection likely. Carrying stones adds weight and limits mobility. Striking stones makes noise, which could attract predators. And yet the practice spread, appearing at multiple sites across East Africa. The benefits outweighed the risks. What is striking is how quickly the older one tradition lasted. For nearly 1 million years, hominins used essentially the same simple toolkit. Unlike later bursts of innovation, the Oldowan was stable. It was a way of life, passed down through generations. This stability suggests not a lack of intelligence, but a balance between effort and reward. Why make tools more complex if flakes already did the job? For our ancestors at this stage, survival was not about perfection, but sufficiency. Another layer to consider is social. Tool use implies teaching, or at least imitation. A young hominin would not instinctively know how to strike flakes. They would need to watch and copy. This suggests that the older one was not just a physical innovation, but a social one, carried in memory, shared within groups. Culture in its earliest form was born here, in the clack of stone against stone. But again, we must be humble. These inferences rest on scattered evidence. A pile of flakes tells us they were struck, but not who struck them or how knowledge passed. A cut-marked bone tells us meat was sliced, but not whether it was hunted or scavenged. We reconstruct behaviour from fragments, always aware of how much is missing. The temptation is to tell clean stories, but the reality is murkier. Still, what we know is enough to say this. Around 2.6 million years ago, an ape began reshaping stone, and nothing would ever be the same. To step back, what made the first chipped stone matter more than sticks? It was not just sharpness, it was permanence, calories, and culture. Stone flakes opened marrow, left marks in bone, and endured in the earth. They gave access to food that reshaped survival, and they carried knowledge across generations. No stick has left a record this durable. In stone, behaviour fossilized, and because of that, we can sit here today and listen to the echo of the first strike. But this story also carries humility. For nearly 1 million years after those first stones, there was little change. Innovation did not race forward. The pace of progress, if we can even call it progress, was glacial. Our ancestors were not yet inventors in the modern sense. They were opportunists, shaping their world just enough to survive. Perhaps that is why the older one is so haunting. It reminds us that technology does not begin with brilliance. It begins with small, imperfect acts repeated until they stick. And so we look back 2.5 million years and see apes on a riverbank striking stones. Not heroes, not geniuses, but survivors. Their world was dangerous, their lives were short, but their hands carried a new possibility. From those hands eventually came cities, satellites and screens. But in that moment, it was only about meat on bone and marrow in stone. It was only about making another day possible. And that was enough. There is another unresolved debate at the heart of this story. We often credit the first stones to Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis, but some researchers argue that Australopiths may have been the true pioneers. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 in Ethiopia, near where Lucy's skeleton was found, archaeologists uncovered animal bones dated to about 3.4 million years ago. These bones bear marks that look suspiciously like cuts and percussion scars, the kind that sharp flakes and hammerstones leave behind. If those marks are genuine and not the result of natural processes, it would push the origins of stone tool use nearly 1 million years earlier than Gona. That would place toolmaking firmly in the hands of Australopithecus afarensis, not Homo. The problem is that the evidence is ambiguous. Some argue the marks are consistent with trampling or natural abrasion rather than deliberate cutting. Others maintain that the patterns and locations match butchery too closely to be accidental. The debate remains unsettled, but the very possibility that Australopiths made tools complicates the neat story of Homo as the innovator. It suggests that the boundary between Australopith and Homo was more porous than we like to think. Upright walking, dietary shifts, and even tool use may all have been traits tested by multiple lineages before our own took them further. The same ambiguity appears at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in Kenya, where tools dated to about 3.3 million years ago were discovered. These are larger and cruder than the Oldowan, and some researchers call them 𝐓𝐹. They may represent an even earlier tradition of stone use, one that predates Homo entirely. If that is true, then striking stones was not a sudden invention, but a gradual unfolding across species. Oldowan may have been the refinement of an older practice, not its genesis. The evidence from bones adds more weight to this debate. At sites associated with Oldowan tools, bones of animals show clear-cut marks that cannot be explained by natural processes. Long bones are fractured in spiral patterns consistent with marrow extraction. Ribs are sliced cleanly, suggesting the removal of flesh. These traces show that whoever struck the stones was not doing it for curiosity alone, but for calories. The flakes were part of a survival strategy, and that strategy may have been tested by more than one species. This ambiguity is not a weakness of the fossil record, but its nature. Species boundaries 2 million years ago were not as clean as textbook diagrams suggest. Populations overlapped, exchanged traits, and tried similar solutions. To say Homo made the first tools may be partly true, but so too might be the claim that Australopiths experimented first. What we call Homo habilis today may itself be a mosaic of traits, some inherited from earlier Australopiths, some pushing toward later Homo. The lines blur because evolution does not care about our categories. What we can say with confidence is that around 2.6 million years ago, chipped stones became widespread enough to leave a clear trace. From that point on, toolmaking was not an occasional experiment, but a consistent part of hominin life. Whether Australopiths were the first to strike flakes or not, the Oldowan marks the moment the practice took root and spread. From that point forward, the Earth itself began to record culture in stone, and that may be the deepest reason the first chipped stone mattered more than sticks. It was not only sharper, not only more useful, but more enduring. It left a record that could outlast rivers, forests, and species. A record that allows us, millions of years later, to argue, to doubt, and to marvel at the clack of stone against stone on an ancient riverbank. In those faint scars, we see not only survival, but the first steps of a lineage that would never again live without tools. If stone flakes marked the moment our ancestors began reshaping the world, fire marked the moment they began transforming it. 2 million years ago, the African landscape was already alive with flame. Lightning strikes sparked wildfires across grasslands, consuming shrubs and trees in plumes of smoke. For predators and prey alike, fire was danger. But for a particular kind of ape, it may have become more than that. Was cooking the real split between chimps and us? If so, then what separated us from the forest was not just our posture or our tools, but our relationship to flame itself. The evidence is elusive. Fire leaves traces in ash and charcoal, but after millions of years those traces are hard to distinguish from natural burning. Archaeologists scour caves and ancient lake beds for blackened bones and reddened sediments, trying to separate deliberate fire use from accidental. Some of the oldest possible evidence comes from sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in Kenya and Swartkrans in South Africa. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, researchers found patches of reddened soil and burned stone fragments dated to around 1.5 million years ago. At Swartkrans, animal bones from cave deposits show discoloration consistent with burning. Both sites suggest that fire may have been present in hominin contexts earlier than once thought, but the interpretation remains debated. Was the fire controlled, or just opportunistically used when lightning struck nearby? We cannot yet say with certainty. What we can say is that by the time Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago, bodies were already changing in ways that suggest diet itself had shifted. Compared to Australopiths, erectus had smaller teeth, reduced jaws, and larger bodies. These features point toward a diet that was easier to chew and digest. One explanation is that cooking had entered the picture. Cooked food softens fibres, releases calories, and kills pathogens. It transforms raw roots into digestible starch, raw meat into tender protein. Even a simple roasted tuber yields more energy than its raw version. Cooking does what teeth and jaws no longer need to do. This link between fire, food, and body size forms the core of what is called the energy budget hypothesis. The human brain is extraordinarily costly to run. Pound for pound, it consumes far more calories than other organs. To support such an organ, our ancestors needed a reliable way to extract more energy from their food, without spending more time chewing. Cooking may have been that solution. By pre-digesting food with heat, the gut could shrink, chewing time could shorten, and the freed energy could be diverted to the brain. In this view, fire was not simply warmth or light, it was fuel for cognition. Skeptics point out that the earliest clear evidence for controlled fire comes later, closer to 1 million years ago. They caution against tying erectus anatomy too tightly to cooking. It is possible that other changes in diet, such as increased meat consumption and marrow extraction, could explain the anatomy. Indeed, evidence of marrow cracking is abundant from sites around 2 million years ago. Long bones of antelope and other large animals are found fractured in spiral patterns, indicating deliberate smashing for the fat-rich marrow inside. This fat would have been an invaluable energy source, perhaps bridging the gap before fire was fully mastered. The image that emerges is of a gradual shift. Around 2 million years ago, hominins were experimenting with new diets, made possible by tools and scavenging. They cracked bones for marrow, stripped meat with flakes, and may have begun using natural fire when available. Whether they controlled it or not is still unclear, but by 1 million years ago the evidence strengthens. At sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dating to about 1 million years ago, ash deposits deep inside the cave suggest hominins brought fire indoors deliberately. This is harder to dismiss as natural. From then on, fire was clearly a part of human life. But even if deliberate control came later, the foundations were being laid around 2 million years ago. To appreciate the significance of cooking, consider what life without it entails. Chimpanzees spend much of their waking day chewing. Their jaws and digestive systems are built for raw plant foods. If humans tried to survive the same way, we would need enormous guts and hours of constant chewing. Cooking compresses time. A roasted root can be eaten quickly and digested efficiently. A boiled bone yields broth that delivers nutrients without gnawing. Fire did not just provide energy, it gave time to do something other than eat. But fire was more than a metabolic trick. It changed the landscape itself. Wildfires created open patches of grassland where grazing animals flourished. Hominins following herds may have learned to scavenge more effectively after burns, when carcasses lay exposed. The smell of smoke may have become a cue, drawing them to opportunities. Eventually, perhaps, groups learned to linger near naturally burned areas, to carry smouldering branches to nurture sparks. At first, fire was borrowed, not controlled. But even borrowed fire was transformative. The cost, as always, was real. Fire burns as well as cooks. Accidents must have been common. Smoke irritates eyes and lungs. Sitting too close to flames leaves scars. Yet over generations the benefits must have outweighed the dangers. The warmth extended activity into cooler nights. The light pushed back darkness. Predators may have hesitated at the edge of a fire circle. Even before cooking was perfected, fire offered a sphere of safety and community. Around flames, hominins gathered. Perhaps this gathering, as much as the calories, was the beginning of something new. The story of fire at this stage is a story of maybes. The evidence is fragmentary, the interpretations contested. Did Homo erectus truly cook, or only roast opportunistically? Did they control flames, or only borrow them? We cannot yet be certain. But what we can see in the bones, in the teeth, and in the charred sediments is a pattern. Diet was shifting, bodies were enlarging, brains were expanding, and fire was at least close by. Whether fully controlled or not, it was becoming part of the human niche. So was cooking the real split between chimps and us? If by split we mean the decisive difference, perhaps not alone. Bipedalism, tools, and social learning all played roles. But if we look at what truly set our lineage on a path no other ape followed, fire is a strong candidate. Chimps crack nuts and fish termites, but they do not cook. Gorillas chew leaves, but they do not roast tubers. We alone transformed our diet with flame, and in doing so we may have transformed ourselves. The thought lingers. If fire had not been borrowed, if marrow had not been cracked, if food had not been softened by heat, could our brains have ever grown as they did? Or would we have remained clever apes trapped by the limits of raw chewing and long guts? The spark on the savannah may have been more than light. It may have been the hinge of our becoming. Another line of evidence that strengthens the case for dietary change around 2 million years ago comes not from fire itself, but from bones shattered by stone. Across sites in eastern South Africa, archaeologists find long bones of antelope and other large animals broken in ways that only deliberate force can explain. The fractures spiral, indicating they were cracked while fresh, not long after death. Impact scars match hammerstones. At Olduvai Gorge, some bones bear both cut marks from stone flakes and percussion pits from marrow extraction. These are not accidents of geology or trampling. They are fingerprints of hands wielding stone against bone. Marrow is a food modern humans rarely think about, but for our ancestors it was gold. Hidden deep within bones, it is rich in fat, dense in calories, and protected from most scavengers. Lions and hyenas can strip flesh, but only a creature with the ability to break bones can reliably access marrow. By doing so, early Homo tapped a resource largely invisible to competitors. Even without fire, marrow provided high-quality nutrition that may have supported larger bodies and, eventually, larger brains. Fire only expanded this access further, softening what was otherwise too tough to chew or too risky to digest raw. Physiology also tells the story. Compared to Australopiths, Homo erectus had smaller teeth and jaws, yet larger bodies. Australopiths carried massive molars and thick enamel, tools for grinding fibrous roots and hard seeds. Erectus, by contrast, seemed freed from this burden. Their faces flattened, their chewing muscles reduced. Something in their diet had changed to make heavy chewing less necessary. Fire provides a neat explanation. Cooked food does not demand the same dental machinery. But even if cooking was not yet fully controlled, the regular consumption of marrow and meat, cut with flakes and perhaps roasted when possible, could explain the same pattern. The gut offers another clue. Though we do not have fossilized intestines, comparative anatomy suggests Erectus likely had a smaller digestive tract than Australopiths. This is inferred from rib cage shape and body proportions, as well as the simple principle of energy budgets. A smaller gut is possible only if food is easier to digest and richer in energy. Cooking, by breaking down starches and proteins, would have allowed this shift. So would marrow and meat, pre-processed by stone. Together, these changes form a coherent picture. By 2 million years ago, diet was already reshaping bodies in ways that set our lineage apart. Skeptics rightly remind us that correlation is not proof. Reduced jaws could have other explanations. Larger brains could result from complex ecological pressures beyond diet. But it is difficult to ignore the convergence of evidence. Cut marks on bones, burned sediments, anatomical changes, all appearing within the same window of time. Each piece on its own is ambiguous. Together they point toward a world where food was being transformed, where calories were being unlocked in new ways. It is humbling to realize how much of our story may rest on something as small as marrow inside a bone, or starch inside a root. These are not dramatic inventions like the wheel or the printing press. They are quiet shifts, unnoticed except in survival. Yet from them, whole bodies changed. The spark of fire and the crack of bone may have mattered more to our becoming than any later triumph. Survival did not start with brilliance. It started with fat flame and the stubborn persistence of apes learning to eat differently. By 1.8 million years ago, a new kind of ape stood ready to test the world. Upright walking was no longer awkward compromise, but a practiced rhythm. Brains were larger, bodies taller, diets richer in meat and marrow, and fire perhaps flickering at the edges of life. These were the beings we call Homo erectus, and for reasons still debated, they became the first of our lineage to leave Africa behind. No other ape has done this. Chimpanzees and gorillas remain tethered to their forests. Orangutans cling to shrinking patches of Southeast Asia, but Homo erectus wandered. By 1.5 million years ago, their bones and tools appear across Eurasia, from the grasslands of the Caucasus to the river valleys of China and the islands of Indonesia. Why did they move so far while their cousins stayed home? The answer begins with bodies. Fossils of Homo erectus show proportions strikingly different from earlier Australopiths. Their legs were long, torsos narrower, pelvises reshaped for efficient bipedalism. Their stature approached modern human height, with some individuals exceeding 5 feet. This new body plan was built not for climbing, but for walking and running across long distances. Endurance became their ecological strategy. Unlike chimpanzees, who tire quickly on the ground, erectus could travel far in search of food and water. This endurance walking, combined with a flexible diet, made them uniquely suited to life in open landscapes. The archaeological record supports this. At Denisovans in Georgia, just south of the Caucasus Mountains, fossils of Homo erectus dated to about 1.8 million years ago have been uncovered alongside simple stone tools. The site preserves multiple individuals, some elderly, some young, revealing not just dispersal, but community. Denisovans is remarkable because it lies far outside Africa, and yet it is nearly as old as the earliest erectus fossils within Africa. This suggests that dispersal began almost as soon as erectus itself emerged. They did not linger long. Once equipped with their new anatomy and behaviour, they stepped out into the wider world. From Denisovans, evidence spreads eastward. In Java, Indonesia, fossils of Homo erectus appear by about 1.6 million years ago. In northern China, stone tools and bones suggest their presence around the same time. This means that within only a few 100,000 years, a blink in evolutionary terms, erectus populations had reached thousands of miles from their African homeland. No primate had ever occupied such range before. Why did they go? Perhaps it was not a grand migration, but simply the result of curiosity and movement over generations. Populations expand when food allows, and groups pushed outward would have followed rivers, coastlines, and herds. Climate shifts also opened corridors of grassland across the Middle East into Eurasia, inviting passage. Unlike chimps, who remain tied to dense forest fruit, erectus could survive on varied resources, scavenged meat, roasted tubers, gathered plants. This flexibility reduced the need to stay tethered to one habitat. If nearby valleys offered opportunity, they could be taken. Over centuries, the distances added up until populations found themselves far from Africa without ever planning a journey. There was risk in this boldness. To leave familiar landscapes meant encountering predators, climates, and diseases unknown. Yet the fossils show survival. At Denisovans, one skull belonged to an elderly individual who had lost all but one tooth. The fact that this individual lived long after tooth loss suggests others in the group helped feed them. This hints at cooperation, a trait that may have buffered the dangers of expansion. Chimps, for all their intelligence, do not carry disabled companions across landscapes. Erectus may have, and that social resilience may have been as important as anatomy in reaching new lands. The tools they carried were still older one in style at this stage. Simple flakes, cores, and hammer stones. Echeli and hand axes, the more refined bifaces appear later. This means the first great dispersal happened not with sophisticated technology, but with persistence and adaptability. They did not need perfection to move outward. They only needed sufficiency. Stones sharp enough to cut, legs strong enough to walk, minds flexible enough to adapt. With that they filled continents. It is humbling to compare this with our ape cousins. Chimps today live in territories of only a few dozen square kilometres. They defend them fiercely, and rarely if ever expand beyond forest margins. Their diets and behaviours lock them in place. Homo erectus, by contrast, was untethered. The boldness to step into unknown lands may not have been conscious, but it was decisive. Once a lineage proves capable of living beyond its birthland, the world is no longer closed. the first steps out of Africa cracked open the possibility of global humanity. The cost of this expansion is harder to see, but worth considering. Many erectus groups that left Africa surely perished. Populations may have been cut off, stranded or overwhelmed by unfamiliar environments. The fossils we find are only the survivors. Each site represents a triumph, but between them must lie many failures erased by time. Migration is not a straight arrow of success. It is a scatter of attempts, most of which vanish. Still, what remains is enough to tell us something extraordinary. By 1.5 million years ago, our lineage was no longer confined to one continent. Chimps stayed put because forests bound them. We wandered because landscapes invited us and our bodies allowed it. Was it bravery, necessity, or simply the slow drift of survival? Perhaps all at once. What is certain is that with Erectus, a new pattern began. Humans became a species defined not by staying, but by moving. And yet, as we reflect, we must keep humility. The record is incomplete. Many regions between Africa and East Asia remain unsampled. Each new discovery has the potential to rewrite the story. Denisovans itself overturned assumptions by showing that Erectus left Africa earlier and with simpler tools than once thought. Tomorrow another site may shift the timeline again. We do not have all the answers. We only know that around 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago, an ape like us took the first long steps into the wider world, steps no other ape has taken. So why did Homo erectus wander so far while chimps stayed put? The answer may be as simple as this. Chimps were bound to trees, we were freed by endurance. Once legs grew long and diets flexible, the horizon stopped being a wall and became a path. And once that path was open, our lineage never stopped walking. When we speak of bottlenecks, we usually imagine numbers on a graph plunging downward. But in reality, what this meant for early humans was groups scattered thin across vast landscapes, each one carrying only a fragment of the genetic and cultural diversity of the whole. Picture a band of a few dozen individuals clinging to a fertile valley, while hundreds of kilometres away, another band struggles on the edge of survival. If drought or disease wiped out one group, their knowledge of edible plants, their traditions of tool-making, even their dialect of communication vanished with them. Extinction was not just biological, but cultural. Each bottleneck meant forgotten lifeways we will never reconstruct. The geological record confirms that this period was unusually unstable. The Middle Pleistocene, stretching from around 800,000 to 500,000 years ago, saw rapid oscillations between warmer interglacial phases and colder glacial phases. These swings happened on scales of tens of thousands of years, long for an individual but short for a species trying to adapt. Grasslands would spread and then contract, rivers would swell and then dry. Animal herds would migrate in patterns that no generation could predict with certainty. For a species dependent on mobility and endurance, such volatility was both an opportunity and a threat. It is also during these bottlenecks that small differences in behaviour could have outsized consequences. A group that remembered how to exploit tubers during droughts might persist where another starved. A group that formed tighter social bonds could share food more reliably when resources grew thin. These are the kinds of advantages invisible in the fossil record but essential in explaining survival. When numbers are low, culture becomes as critical as biology. What makes bottlenecks haunting is not only that they shrink populations, but that they magnify chance. A storm, a volcanic eruption, an epidemic. Any of these could wipe out an entire lineage if it happened to strike when numbers were already low. This means that our survival through such times was not the product of superiority, but of contingency. We are here because our ancestors happened to make it through gauntlets that erased others. The absence of their bones is not proof of weakness, only of misfortune. So when we speak of the bottlenecks of 800,000 to 500,000 years ago, we should not imagine a single narrow gate, but a series of sieves, each straining diversity, each leaving behind fewer groups, each amplifying the role of chance. Out of those fragile survivals, later lineages would grow. But beneath them is the echo of all the bands that did not. If you want to see the difference between us and our ape cousins, do not start with the brain. Start with the face. Chimpanzees carry jaws that push forward, heavy brow ridges, and teeth suited for grinding raw vegetation. Their faces are powerful tools for chewing, biting, and surviving in a forest world. Ours are small, flat, and fragile by comparison. The change is so striking that fossils alone, even without brains, reveal the story. Between 1.5 and 0.8 million years ago, the faces of our ancestors began to shrink. Why did our faces retreat while theirs stayed strong? The answer lies in diet, in fire, and in the hidden architecture of speech. The earliest members of Homo erectus still carried large jaws compared to us, but smaller than the Australopiths that came before. Over the next several 100,000 years, this trend accelerated. Fossil skulls from sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 in China, dating to around 700,000 years ago, show reduced teeth and jaws compared to earlier hominins. The once massive molars of Australopiths were gone, replaced by teeth more like ours. The forward-projecting muzzle of earlier apes flattened. Faces tucked beneath the skull rather than jutting outward. Slowly, the human profile was taking shape. The most common explanation is cooking. Once fire was harnessed, food no longer needed the same crushing power to process. Tubers roasted in embers softened into edible starch. Meat roasted over flame became tender. Even bones, cracked for marrow, could be scorched to loosen their contents. Every step reduced the need for massive jaws and thick enamel. Natural selection, always attentive to efficiency, could then favour smaller teeth and lighter skulls. Chewing less meant energy could be saved, and reduced jaw muscles freed space at the top of the skull for an expanding brain case. But the story may not be as simple as fire alone. Some researchers argue that changes in food preparation, even without full cooking, played a role. Stone tools allowed slicing, pounding, and grinding long before fire was controlled. Even raw meat, if cut into thin strips, is easier to chew. Roots cracked open with hammerstones could be eaten without enormous molars. These practices may have begun jaw reduction even before fire was a daily habit. Fire accelerated what stone began. As jaws shrank, something else became possible. The anatomy of the mouth and throat shifted. In apes, the larynx sits high in the throat, limiting the range of vowel sounds. As faces flattened and throats lengthened, the vocal tract became capable of producing a wider range of sounds. We do not know when language emerged, but the groundwork for speech was being laid in this period. The shrinking of the face was not just about chewing less. It was about opening the architecture for communication that would one day define us. This does not mean Homo erectus or its relatives spoke as we do. There is no evidence of symbolic language at this stage. But the anatomy was moving in that direction. The base of the skull shows changes in the flexion of the cranial floor, which may reflect shifts in the vocal tract. The hyoid bone, a small structure in the throat crucial for speech, has been found in later fossils showing human-like form. Together, these suggest that as the face retreated, the voice was preparing to advance. There were trade-offs. Smaller jaws made us more vulnerable to dental crowding, impacted wisdom teeth, and other problems that plague us today. The very flatness that allowed speech left less room for teeth, and the mismatch remains with us. Evolution rarely produces perfection. It balances costs against benefits. For our ancestors, the benefits of diet change and potential vocal flexibility outweighed the costs of crooked teeth and weaker bites. The shrinking of the face also changed social life. Expressions became more visible when the muzzle receded. The human face carries muscles that allow subtle communication, raised brows, smiles, frowns. These may have gained greater significance as faces flattened and became canvases for emotion. Chimps communicate with expressions too, but their projecting jaws and heavy ridges mask subtlety. Our faces became more open, more legible, and perhaps more tied to social bonds. The story of jaw reduction is not just about diet, but about interaction. Fossils bear this out. At sites across Africa, Asia, and Europe dated between 1.5 and 0.8 million years ago, skulls show wide variation, but a consistent trend towards smaller jaws and teeth. In Africa, erectus specimens from sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 display this reduction. In Asia, the 𝐓𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 fossils reinforce it. Across continents, separate populations were converging on the same solution. This suggests the pressures were universal, not regional quirks, but fundamental changes in how our ancestors lived and ate. Still, caution is necessary. Some populations retained larger jaws longer, and there is variation across fossils. Evolution is never uniform. It is a patchwork of traits shifting at different rates in different places. What we see in the record is not a straight line, but a tendency, shaped by local ecologies. Yet the long-term direction is clear, towards smaller, flatter faces, toward the anatomy we know today. So why did our faces shrink while theirs stayed powerful? Chimps remained bound to raw diets, their forests demanding constant chewing of fibrous plants. They needed their massive jaws and molars. We did not. With tools, fire, and new diets, we stepped away from those constraints. Our faces lightened, our voices expanded, and our social worlds grew more intricate. The change was not dramatic in a single lifetime, but over hundreds of thousands of years it reshaped the very way we appear to one another. Perhaps the most humbling reflection is that this change, so central to who we are, is recorded not in grand monuments or achievements, but in the size of molars, the angle of jaws, the flexion of bone at the base of the skull. These small anatomical details carry the weight of our becoming. They remind us that what sets us apart was not destiny, but adaptation. Faces remade by fire, by food, by the simple need to chew less and speak more. And in those quiet transformations, the seeds of humanity were planted long before we thought to call ourselves human. Another perspective on the shrinking face comes from biomechanics. Studies of jaw muscles show that earlier Australopiths and even the first Homo erectus had thick ridges of bone along the skull called sagittal crests, where chewing muscles anchored. These ridges allowed massive forces to grind raw vegetation. As jaws reduced in later Homo erectus, those crests disappeared. The muscle forces no longer needed to be so great. The skull became smoother, the vault rounder, and the brain case could expand upward without being crowded by chewing machinery. This was not only an aesthetic change, but a redistribution of priorities. Less power for chewing, more room for thought. Regional fossils give texture to this shift. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 near Lake Turkana in Kenya, skulls dated to roughly 1.5 million years ago show faces already smaller than their predecessors, with teeth trending downward in size. Thousands of kilometers away, at Zhoukoudian near Beijing, individuals living between 700,000 and 500,000 years ago carried similar features, even though they were separated by vast distance and time. This parallel reduction suggests a shared adaptive pressure rather than local accident. Across continents, human ancestors were converging on a lighter face. One might ask whether this made them more vulnerable. After all, smaller jaws meant weaker bites compared to other apes. But vulnerability is relative. If fire and tools compensated for the lost chewing force, then the reduced face was not a weakness but an efficiency. Natural selection does not reward the strongest bite, but the strategy that wastes the least energy while still ensuring survival. In this sense, a shrinking face was not a liability, but a trade that freed energy for growth elsewhere. This transformation may also have had subtle social consequences. In groups of erectus, individuals with flatter faces and smaller jaws may have looked more like us, more recognizably expressive. It is speculative, but perhaps communication became slightly easier, expression slightly clearer, bonds slightly stronger. Over time, even small advantages in understanding others could have supported survival. A face, after all, is not just a tool for chewing. It is also a stage for social life. In this period, the shift in faces reminds us that evolution is not always about dramatic inventions. Sometimes it is about subtraction. Losing heavy jaws, losing massive teeth, losing the ridges that anchored them. In return, our lineage gained a lighter skull, a more flexible voice, and eventually the possibility of language and culture. What looked like reduction was, in truth, expansion, not in the face itself, but in what the face made possible. There is a silence in the fossil record that feels almost deliberate. Between 800,000 and 500,000 years ago, traces of our ancestors grow sparse. The bones we do find hint at populations stretched thin, scattered across shifting landscapes, surviving through cycles of cold and warmth that threatened to erase them entirely. This was the age of bottlenecks, when hominin diversity shrank, when entire lineages vanished, and when survival was not guaranteed. If near extinction shaped the few survivors who would one day become us, then this is where the story narrows. The Earth itself was the architect of these bottlenecks. The Middle Pleistocene was defined by a new rhythm of glacial and interglacial cycles. Ice sheets advanced and retreated with a regularity that reshaped climates worldwide. Grasslands would expand across Africa during cooler, drier phases, then retreat as forests returned with warming. Rivers dried to dust and then swelled again, forcing animals and humans alike to move or perish. For hominins already stretched across continents, this volatility was relentless. No environment remained stable for long enough to guarantee security. Each cycle was another test. In such conditions, population numbers likely fluctuated dramatically. Genetic studies of living humans suggest that deep in our ancestry, effective population sizes sometimes shrank to only a few thousand individuals. That does not mean there were literally only a few thousand people alive, but that breeding populations were small enough that genetic diversity eroded. When numbers fall that low, chance becomes a tyrant. A storm, a drought, or a disease outbreak can erase entire lineages. Survival depends as much on luck as on adaptation. Fossils show the pattern indirectly. In Africa, sites like Bodo in Ethiopia preserve skulls dated to about 600,000 years ago, large-brained but still archaic in form. In Europe, remains from Atapuerca in Spain, known as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐏𝐒, appear in caves dated to around 600 to 400,000 years ago. These populations were sturdy, with heavy brows and robust bodies, but the record suggests they were isolated pockets, not vast thriving networks. In Asia, Erectus still persisted, but again the sites are scattered, the populations thin. The impression is of survival in enclaves rather than expansion across the map. The climate data matches this. Ocean sediment cores and ice records show that glacial cycles during this period grew more severe and prolonged compared to earlier times. What had once been moderate swings now became extreme, with colder glaciations lasting longer. For animals that relied on consistent habitats, this meant contraction. For hominins, it meant repeated bottlenecks. Each cold pulse could shrink ranges, reduce prey, and splinter groups into fragments. Each warm pulse could then expand opportunities again, but the damage was already done. Genetic diversity lost in the crash could not easily be regained. It is tempting to imagine bottlenecks as purely destructive, but they may also have been formative. Small, isolated populations sometimes innovate under pressure. Cultural practices, tool use, and cooperation become survival strategies. If larger, more diverse populations were erased, the ones that remained were those that managed to endure scarcity, to maintain cohesion when numbers were low. In that sense, bottlenecks acted as filters, not for superiority in the mythic sense, but for resilience. The stubborn capacity to survive when conditions were hostile. The archaeological record supports this with hints of behavioural change. Around this time, stone tool traditions begin to shift from the old Owen to more refined Acheulean hand axes. The timing varies by region, but the pattern is global. Whether the Acheulean reflects a true leap in cognition, or simply incremental refinement, its spread suggests that even during bottlenecks, knowledge endured. Groups that survived were not only maintaining stone technology, but slowly improving it, even when populations were few. Culture became the thread that tied survival together. We should be cautious, however, not to romanticize. Bottlenecks meant suffering. They meant infants lost, groups scattered, elders dying without successors. Each valley that dried, each forest that burned, each herd that vanished cut into the fragile margins of existence. For every lineage that carried forward, others ended. Some hominins may have been as capable as those who survived, but they were simply unlucky in geography, struck down by drought, flood, or isolation. Extinction is rarely about failure. It is about chance colliding with vulnerability. What makes this period haunting is that it is both well recorded in the rocks and poorly understood in the bones. Climate science shows us the violence of the cycles in great clarity, yet the human record is fragmentary. We know bottlenecks occurred because we stand on the far side of them, but the details of who lived, who died, and what was lost remain elusive. We can point to Bodo, to Atapuerca, to 𝐓𝐿𝐏𝐿, but these are islands in a sea of absence. Each fossil is less a complete story than a reminder of how much is missing. Still, The implications echo forward. Bottlenecks reduce diversity. Reduced diversity can lock lineages into narrow paths. It may be that our own species emerged from precisely such narrowing, shaped by constraints imposed in these dark centuries. If so, then near extinction was not just a brush with oblivion, but the crucible of later success. We are, in that sense, the children of survivors twice over. Survivors of predators and scarcity, and survivors of chance itself. So did near extinction shape the few survivors that became us? The evidence suggests yes, though we cannot yet trace the exact lines. What we can say is that between 800,000 and 500,000 years ago, the Earth itself squeezed our lineage through cycles of cold and warmth that erased many and left only a few. From those few, the later story unfolded. To stand here today is to carry their improbable survival in our bones, and to look back is to glimpse the fragility of our own origins, balanced always between endurance and disappearance. When most people picture human evolution, they imagine a line. One figure leads to another, stooped ape to upright person, a tidy march across a textbook page. But if you look at the fossil record between 700,000 and 400,000 years ago, the line dissolves. Instead you see a tangle, a bush with many stems sprouting, crossing and withering. It is a story not of inevitability but of experiments. Branches that appeared, thrived for a while, and then vanished. If survival is the exception rather than the rule, then these cousins remind us how fragile our own place is. One of the central figures in this time is Homo heidelbergensis. The species is named after a jaw found near Heidelberg in Germany in the early 20th century, but its range stretched far beyond Europe. Fossils attributed to heidelbergensis appear across Africa and Western Eurasia, dating between about 700,000 and 400,000 years ago. They had large brains, often approaching the size of ours, heavy brows and robust bodies built for survival in varied environments. They were skilled with Acheulean hand axes, capable of hunting large animals and may have built simple shelters. For many researchers, heidelbergensis represents a common ancestor, a root that gave rise later to both Neanderthals in Europe and our own lineage in Africa. But in their own time, they were not on their way to anyone. They were successful in their own right, thriving for hundreds of thousands of years before fading. Alongside heidelbergensis, other branches emerged that do not fit neatly into the main story. One of the most startling discoveries of recent decades was Homo naledi, found in the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. These fossils, first described in 2015, show a strange mosaic. Naledi had a small brain, no larger than that of an Australopith, yet their hands and feet looked surprisingly modern. They lived as recently as 300,000 years ago, overlapping with larger-brained cousins, yet persisting in their own ecological niche. Their presence shatters the idea that brain size alone determines survival. Naledi shows us that small-brained hominins could endure alongside bigger-brained relatives for long stretches, carrying their own strategies in secret corners of the continent. Even more astonishing is the discovery of Homo floresiensis on the Indonesian island of Flores. Nicknamed the Hobbit for their short stature, these hominins stood barely over a metre tall with brains smaller than chimpanzees, yet they made stone tools and hunted small elephants. They survived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, long after other branches had gone. How they arrived on the island remains a mystery, since reaching Flores required crossing water. Some argue they descended from early Homo erectus populations that became isolated and shrank in size. Others propose a more ancient lineage. Whatever their origin, Floresiensis reminds us that human evolution was not about a single upward climb, but about survival in diverse and often surprising forms. Taken together, these branches paint a picture of plurality. Around 700,000 to 400,000 years ago, the world was not home to a single human species, but to many. In Africa, heidelbergensis flourished. In South Africa, Naledi lived in hidden caves. In Southeast Asia, Floresiensis carved tools on a remote island. In East Asia, Erectus still lingered. The planet was a patchwork of cousins, each adapted to its own environment, each walking upright, each recognisably human in some ways and profoundly alien in others. Why did so many appear? and vanish? The answer lies in both ecology and chance. Climate cycles during this period were harsh, with glacial advances and retreats reshaping habitats. Each population faced unique pressures. In some cases, isolation fostered adaptation, as on Flores. In others, small brains may have sufficed in stable niches, as with Naledi. But extinction shadows every branch. Populations that were small, scattered, or specialized were vulnerable to collapse. A drought, a disease, or the arrival of a competitor could erase them. Survival did not always reward the largest brain or the most advanced tools. It rewarded those who fit their environment until the environment changed. The discovery of these branches forces us to abandon the myth of a single story. Evolution is not a ladder to the present, but a bush full of dead ends. Most species that ever lived are extinct, and hominins are no exception. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, Naledi, Floresiensis, all gone, leaving only fragments of bone and stone. Yet their absence is as important as their presence. They remind us that we were never alone, that humanity was once plural, and that survival is always provisional. It is humbling to think that if we could step back into a world 500,000 years ago, we might meet half a dozen kinds of upright apes, some with large brains and heavy brows, others tiny with delicate bones, all living at once. To them, nothing seemed strange about this plurality. It was simply the world they inhabited. Only we, the last branch left, look back and find it astonishing. So why did so many cousins appear and vanish? Because evolution experiments endlessly, and most experiments end. Because climates shift, populations dwindle, and luck runs out. And because survival does not follow a straight line to us. We are only one twig on a tree filled with cut stems. The branches we lost are not failures. They are reminders. They show us that being human was never about one species destined to rule, but about many species trying, enduring, and eventually fading. To know them is to see our own survival, not as destiny, but as improbable continuation, resting on the silence of all the others. One of the most evocative windows into this period comes from Atapuerca in northern Spain. Deep inside a cave system known as Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of at least 24 individuals dating to more than 400,000 years ago. The bones lie together in a shaft as if deliberately placed. Whether this was an early form of mortuary practice or simply the result of geology remains debated, but the sheer number of individuals gives us a rare snapshot of a population rather than an isolated skull. These hominins carried traits we associate with both Homo heidelbergensis and the later Neanderthals. Heavy brows, large faces, robust skeletons. They remind us that species boundaries are rarely clear. Instead of neat categories, we see populations in transition, blurring into one another across time. Atapuerca also shows us the power of accumulation. Most fossil sites offer a jaw, a femur or a handful of teeth. Here, we see dozens of individuals, male and female, young and old. From them we learn about variation within a group, about health and injury, about growth and development. One skull bears signs of intentional blows, perhaps evidence of violence or ritual. Another shows healed fractures, testimony to survival after injury. These details ground us in the lived reality of our cousins, reminding us that their lives were not abstractions but embodied struggles. Beyond Atapuerca, debates continue about how to classify fossils from this era. Some see Heidelbergensis as a single widespread species, others as a catch-all label for multiple populations that do not fit neatly elsewhere. Naledi complicates the picture with its mosaic anatomy. Floresiensis raises questions about isolation and dwarfism. Each discovery forces us to redraw the tree, and each redrawing emphasizes the bushiness of our past. The lesson is not that taxonomy is flawed, but that evolution itself resists tidy categories. Populations drift, overlap, and blur. Extinction trims branches, but while they live, those branches intertwine. When we look at this tangle, we are tempted to search for ourselves, to find which fossils are on the way to modern humans. But this gaze is unfair. To stand in their time was to stand among peers, not prefaces. The Pit of Bones hominins were not waiting to become someone else. They were living their own full lives, hunting in cold forests, gathering in caves, caring for one another. their extinction does not mean failure, only that chance and climate closed their story before ours began. What remains is a haunting silence. For every bone we find, countless others have vanished. For every named species, many more are lost to time. The branches we see are only those that happen to fossilize, that happen to be found. The true bush of humanity was far more tangled, far more diverse, and far more ephemeral than we can ever reconstruct. To glimpse even fragments of it is a gift, and to remember it is to honour all the experiments in being human that ended before we arrived. Half a million years ago, something inside the skull began to swell. The story of humankind is often told as if brain size alone explains our survival, as if bigger brains automatically meant greater intelligence, greater planning, and greater triumph. But the fossils remind us that the truth is more complicated. Yes, around 500,000 years ago, the brains of Homo species began to grow well beyond the limits of their predecessors. Skulls that once held 600 or 700 cubic centimetres now approach 1200. The volume alone looked almost modern. But size is not everything. Brains come with costs as well as capacities. The question is not only what large brains made possible, but what they demanded in return. To grow such a brain requires energy, and energy was scarce. The human brain, though it weighs only about 2% of body mass, consumes roughly 20% of our resting energy today. For earlier hominins, increasing that demand meant something had to give. The gut is one candidate. A smaller digestive tract can free calories for the brain, but only if diet changes to food that is easier to digest, perhaps cooked, perhaps sliced thin with stone tools, perhaps stripped from marrow. Fire, marrow, and meat made large brains metabolically possible. Without them, the brain could never have grown. This trade-off is called the expensive tissue hypothesis, the idea that energy saved in the gut was spent in the skull. The shape of skulls from this time shows the change clearly. At Bodo in Ethiopia, a cranium dated to around 600,000 years ago carries a brain volume of more than 1,200 cubic centimetres, close to modern averages. At Kabwe in Zambia, another skull from perhaps 300,000 years ago shows similar expansion. In Europe, the Atapuerca fossils and later Neanderthal ancestors carried brains as large or larger than ours. The pattern is consistent. Across continents, hominin brains swelled beyond earlier limits. This was not a local accident, but a global trend. But did bigger brains really mean smarter survival? The archaeological record is cautious. Tools around this time show refinement, but not revolution. Acheulean hand axes became more symmetrical and standardized, but the basic form had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Hunting evidence grows clearer, with cut-marked bones suggesting organized efforts to bring down large animals. Yet there is no sign of symbolic culture, no art, no language as we know it. The large brain existed, but what it enabled was still emerging. Intelligence does not fossilize easily. There are also costs beyond energy. Larger brains meant longer childhoods, because more time was needed for growth and learning. This extended dependence required stronger social bonds, with adults investing in children for many years before they could contribute fully. In this way, the large brain reshaped society. To raise offspring successfully, cooperation became more essential. Survival no longer depended only on the individual but on the group's ability to care for its young over long stretches of vulnerability. Another cost was childbirth. Larger brains required larger skulls, but the pelvis of upright walkers could not expand indefinitely. This led to difficult and dangerous births, a challenge that remains with us today. Evolution's compromise was to deliver babies earlier, while their brains were still relatively small and pliable. As a result, human infants were born more helpless than other primates. This helplessness, in turn, deepened social dependence. Large brains forced humans into cooperative care, creating societies that revolved around shared investment in survival. The interior of the brain is harder to study than its size, but endocasts, impressions of the inner skull, offer clues. They show the gradual expansion of the frontal and parietal regions, areas associated in us with planning, problem-solving and social reasoning. Yet we must be careful not to project too much. A bulge in bone does not equate directly to modern thought. What it tells us is that the scaffolding for such thought was forming. The architecture was in place long before its full potential was expressed. It is tempting to see brain expansion as a march toward inevitability, but fossils like Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis remind us that small-brained cousins survived alongside larger-brained ones for long stretches. Brain size alone was not a guarantee of survival. It was one strategy among many. In some niches, small brains sufficed. In others, larger brains opened new possibilities. What made the difference was not size in isolation, but how that size interacted with diet, society, and environment. This period is therefore a study in trade-offs. Energy diverted to brains meant weaker guts. Larger skulls meant riskier births. Longer childhoods meant deeper social obligations. Each gain came with a cost, and survival balanced on whether the benefits outweighed the risks. That our lineage persisted suggests the balance held, but it could easily have tipped the other way. For every advantage of cognition, there were dangers waiting in scarcity, in childbirth, in the sheer metabolic burden of thinking tissue. So did larger brains really mean smarter survival? The evidence says not automatically. Large brains were necessary for what came later, but not sufficient. They gave our ancestors the potential for complex thought, but potential is not destiny. The fossils of 500,000 years ago carry the volume of modern minds, yet the world they left behind is one of stone axes and cut-marked bones, not of paintings or words. Intelligence, as we define it, was still a seed, not yet a tree. And yet, in that seed lay everything. The swelling of the brain around 500,000 years ago made later symbolic thought possible, made language possible, made culture possible. It was not a triumph in itself, but it was the condition for triumphs to come. To look back at these skulls is to see the outlines of our future drawn in bone, silent and waiting. Around 400,000 years ago, new faces began to emerge from the human bush. They were not chimpanzees in disguise, not halfway steps on a ladder to us, but humans in their own right, humans of a different kind. The world we often imagine as empty, waiting for sapiens, was already populated with cousins who thought, hunted, and shaped stone. They were Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the East, and other close relatives we have only begun to glimpse. If we are to understand what it means to be human, we must start by abandoning the myth of a single straight path. These beings were not failures awaiting replacement. They were parallel experiments in intelligence, with histories as long and as complex as our own. The Neanderthals are the most familiar, partly because their bones were discovered first, in the mid-19th century in Germany's Neander Valley, and partly because their fossils are abundant. For over 200,000 years they inhabited Europe and parts of Western Asia. Their bodies were robust, built for strength and endurance in Ice Age climates. Broad noses, heavy brows, and stocky limbs gave them a distinctive profile, but what lay inside the skull was even more remarkable. Neanderthal brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. The old caricature of brutish cavemen has long been dismantled. Their anatomy and their artifacts show us a lineage adapted with sophistication to a harsh world. Denisovans, by contrast, remain more shadow than figure. They were discovered not by a full skeleton but by fragments. A finger bone and a tooth from Denisova cave in Siberia, later joined by other fossils. Genetic analysis revealed that these remains belonged to a distinct lineage, closely related to Neanderthals but separate. Their range likely stretched across vast areas of Asia, from the mountains of Siberia to the tropics of Southeast Asia. Yet their physical appearance remains uncertain. What we know comes largely from DNA, which has revealed not only their existence but their legacy, still carried in the genomes of many living people. What unites Neanderthals and Denisovans in this period is not their differences but their parallel sophistication. Both lineages made tools, both hunted large game, both adapted to climates that would have defeated earlier apes. Their survival for hundreds of thousands of years was not luck. It was intelligence applied to landscape. The tools associated with Neanderthals, known as the Mousterian tradition, show planning, skill, and efficiency. Stone was flaked in systematic ways to produce scrapers, points, and blades suited for butchery and woodworking. These were not random strikes, but deliberate sequences passed down through generations. Denisovan tools remain harder to classify, but evidence from Siberian sites suggests similar sophistication. To call them just another chimp is not only wrong, it is an insult to the deep time they embody. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not animals stumbling in darkness. They controlled fire, built shelters, hunted cooperatively, and cared for their injured. Fossils of Neanderthals with healed fractures show that individuals lived long after injuries that would have crippled them. Survival possible only with group support. This speaks not only to biology, but to society. They endured because they looked after one another. The costs of their adaptations were real. Stocky bodies carried heavy energy demands. Living in Ice Age Europe meant constant challenges in finding food and warmth. For Denisovans in Asia, the demands were different: high mountains, fluctuating climates, unfamiliar prey. Each lineage bore the scars of its environment, and each adjusted in ways we still only dimly understand. But to survive for hundreds of thousands of years is no small feat. Few species manage such longevity. What these cousins remind us is that intelligence is not singular. It is not a trait owned only by us, nor is it measured only by art or writing. Intelligence can take the form of endurance, of tool-making, of social care, of adaptation to hostile climates. Neanderthals and Denisovans each carried versions of intelligence suited to their worlds. That we see them only as preludes to sapiens says more about our bias than about their reality. The fossil record itself fights against ladder thinking. Neanderthal features appear gradually, evolving from earlier Homo heidelbergensis populations in Europe. Denisovans likely diverge from Neanderthal ancestors in Asia. Both branches share roots with us, but neither was simply on the way to us. They were side branches that flourished long before we appeared. To see them as steps is to erase their own stories. It is also to miss the diversity of humanity in this period. Between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, the world was not home to a single human species, but to several, overlapping in range and time. Africa still held populations of Homo heidelbergensis and perhaps other lineages. Europe was Neanderthal country. Asia hosted Denisovans and lingering Homo erectus. Even distant islands carried Floresiensis. Humanity was plural, a patchwork of cousins. Only later would the patchwork unravel until one branch remained. So why weren't Neanderthals and Denisovans just another chimp? Because they were us in different form. They walked upright, thought ahead, shaped stone, and cared for kin. Their disappearance does not erase their humanity. If anything, it highlights the contingency of our survival. We live in a world where only one human branch remains, and we mistake that for destiny. The truth is that for most of prehistory the human condition was plurality, and in that plurality Neanderthals and Denisovans were not lesser. They were equals in the experiment of being human. Denisova Cave in Siberia offers one of the most remarkable glimpses into this plural world. Tucked into the Altai Mountains, the cave has yielded only fragments: a finger bone of a young girl, a few teeth, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau. Yet from these scraps, geneticists reconstructed an entire lineage. The DNA told us that Denisovans were not a minor offshoot, but a population that thrived across vast territories for hundreds of thousands of years. Their genetic legacy persists today in people from Asia and Oceania, a ghost echoing through modern bloodlines. That such influence comes from fossils so meagre reminds us how much remains unseen. Whole populations may have lived and died without leaving more than a trace of bone. Neanderthals, in contrast, left fuller skeletons, and some of them tell intimate stories. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists unearthed the remains of individuals who lived with serious injuries. One skeleton bore evidence of a crushed skull and damaged arm, yet healed enough to show survival for years after. Another lacked the use of one arm entirely, but lived long into adulthood. These were not lives sustained alone. They were carried by the care of others, by food shared, by protection offered. To call Neanderthal brutish is to ignore the tenderness inscribed in their bones. Sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France deepen this picture. The famous old male discovered there had severe arthritis and tooth loss, yet survived into old age. Early 20th century scientists misread the skeleton as hunched and ape-like, fueling stereotypes of Neanderthals as crude cavemen. But reanalysis has shown that the stoop was illness, not anatomy. The real lesson is that Neanderthals endured pain and disability within communities that must have valued individuals beyond their utility as hunters. Compassion was not invented by us. It was already present in them. For Denisovans, we lack such narrative bones, but their genetics tell stories of adaptation. One gene inherited from them helps modern Tibetans survive at high altitude by regulating oxygen use in thin air. This is not mere curiosity. It shows Denisovans had lived and thrived in extreme environments, passing on adaptations that still matter today. Their presence in the evolutionary bush was not marginal, it was consequential, even if we only now realise it. Together, these threads remind us that Neanderthals and Denisovans were not shadows or stepping stones. They were people shaped by their worlds, just as we are shaped by ours. Their survival strategies left marks in cave walls, in cut-marked bones, in DNA still carried in living bodies. To know them is to see that humanity was never one form, never one destiny. It was many, coexisting, caring, adapting, and then vanishing, leaving us to wonder at what might have been if even one of those branches had endured. 300,000 years ago, in the stone quarries of what is now Morocco, fire cracked through bone and flint. A group of hunters left behind traces of their meals. Animal remains, stone flakes, fragments of skulls. They could not have known that one day their bones would be rediscovered and reassembled into the oldest fossils of our own species. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 the faces that emerge from the sediment are not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not Erectus. They are us, Homo sapiens. The birth of our species is often told as if it were sudden, as if one dawn a new kind of human appeared and everything changed. But the fossils tell a different story, one of gradual emergence across a continent, of variation, of many different faces that all belong to what we call human. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 are striking. Their faces are flat and tucked under the brain case, in a way recognisably modern, yet their skulls are long and low, with features more archaic than ours. Their brains were large but differently shaped, not yet globular like those of later sapiens. They look like us, and not like us at the same time. This is the paradox of our birth. To call them fully modern would be misleading. To exclude them from humanity would be dishonest. They represent an early stage in our lineage, close enough to be kin, distinct enough to remind us that being human is not a fixed essence but a shifting boundary. For decades, the textbook story placed our origin at 200,000 years ago in East Africa, but discoveries like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 have pushed the date back and broadened the geography. Instead of a single birthplace, the evidence suggests a pan-African emergence. Fossils from Ethiopia, South Africa and North Africa, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, show populations with mixtures of archaic and modern traits. The implication is that Homo sapiens was not born in one valley or one cave. We were the product of many populations scattered across Africa, connected by movement and mixing, gradually converging on the anatomy we now carry. Our birth was not a point but a process. This Pan-African view reshapes how we see ourselves. It reminds us that diversity was present from the very beginning. The people at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 were not identical to those at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 in Ethiopia, nor to those at Florisbad in South Africa. Each population carried its own blend of traits, its own face. What unites them is not uniformity, but variation within a broader whole. We were never a singular species stamped out of stone. We were always a patchwork. The tools at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 tell their own story. The stone flakes found there belong to what archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age. These tools are more sophisticated than the Acheulean hand axes of earlier times. They show prepared core technology, where stone was shaped carefully before flakes were struck, allowing greater control and efficiency. The people who used them were hunters, capable of bringing down gazelle and processing carcasses with skill. Their survival depended not on brute strength but on planning and cooperation, and yet, for all their modern features, the world of these early sapiens was not yet our world. There is no evidence of symbolic art, no carved figurines or painted walls. Their intelligence was applied to survival, not to expression. They were us, but stripped to essentials: bodies, tools, fire, meat. To imagine them is to see ourselves in a raw state, before language and art transformed what it meant to be human. It is humbling to realise that we are only one variation among many. At the same time that sapiens were emerging in Africa, Neanderthals were flourishing in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and other hominins clung to survival elsewhere. Our birth did not make us unique. It made us plural, one more branch in a bush that was already thick with branches. The difference is not that we were destined to replace the others, but that chance, climate, and later encounters shaped who remained. The shape of our skulls tells another part of the story. Early sapiens, like those at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, low crania, whereas later sapiens developed more rounded, globular brain cases. This change may reflect a shift in brain organisation, particularly in areas associated with integration of information across regions. But again, we should be cautious. A globular skull does not automatically mean modern thought. What it does show is that even within sapiens, anatomy was still evolving. Our species was not born finished. We are still, in a sense, under construction. The Pan-African emergence also challenges old myths of purity. From the very beginning, our species was mixed. Populations moved, interbred, and exchanged traits. There was no single Eve walking alone. There were many women, many men, many groups, each contributing threads to the tapestry. The story of our birth is not the story of a single spark, but of many fires burning across a continent. So what does it mean that we are just one variation of many? It means humility. It means recognizing that our survival is not proof of superiority, but of contingency. The people at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 lived and died never knowing they were the beginning of something that would last. They were simply surviving, as Neanderthals survived, as Denisovans survived. Our birth is not a triumphant dawn, but a fragile moment among many. What sets it apart is only that we can look back and name it. When we sift the bones of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 from Moroccan soil, we are not uncovering destiny. We are uncovering one variation of humanity, one face among many, one echo of a plural world. To know this is to accept that being human was never about perfection or inevitability. It was about survival across diversity. Our birth was not the start of the human story, but one chapter in a book already thick with other lives. By 300,000 years ago, our species had already emerged across Africa. Fossils at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Florisbad in South Africa, and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 show us that sapiens was not a sudden spark, but a network of populations, mixing and diverging across a continent. Given this, one might expect that humans would have poured out of Africa immediately, flooding into Eurasia just as Homo erectus had done almost 2 million years earlier. But they did not. For nearly 200,000 years after our birth, Homo sapiens mostly stayed put. There were attempts to leave, flickers of movement beyond Africa, but they ended in failure. The question is why? What held us back when the world seemed open? Part of the answer lies in climate. The Pleistocene epoch was not a steady backdrop, but a stage of constant shifts. Ice ages advanced and retreated, sea levels rose and fell, deserts expanded and contracted. Africa itself was not a single environment, but a mosaic of grasslands, forests, and arid basins, all changing with the rhythms of glacial cycles. These oscillations created both opportunity and trap. During wetter phases, the Sahara blossomed into savanna with rivers and lakes, opening pathways north into the Levant. During drier phases, the same Sahara became a vast barrier of sand. Our species was caught in these rhythms, able to move outward only during windows that soon closed. Evidence from sites like Mislia Cave in Israel hints that small groups of sapiens reached the Levant as early as 180,000 years ago. But these early emigrants did not last. Their fossils stand as isolated traces with no continuity beyond their moment. Later, other groups ventured into Arabia, leaving tools scattered across ancient riverbeds. Again, they did not persist. The land dried, the rains failed, and populations shrank back or perished. Each migration was like a match struck in the wind, flaring briefly and then extinguished. These failures remind us that migration is not simply about walking. It is about survival in landscapes that may turn against you. To cross deserts, mountains, or coasts requires not only courage, but reliable resources, and in the volatile climate of the Middle Pleistocene, reliability was rare. Lakes that existed one century might vanish in the next. Grasslands that fed herds could transform into dust. Human groups were small, vulnerable, and dependent on cooperation. A shift too sudden, a drought too long, and a population could collapse. Genetics adds another layer. Studies of modern DNA suggest that early sapiens went through bottlenecks, periods when population size was drastically reduced. These bottlenecks may have pruned our diversity, leaving only fragments of what once existed. Whether caused by climate stress, disease, or other factors, the result was that our species carried less variation than expected for its age. In practical terms, bottlenecks meant fewer people available to migrate, fewer groups robust enough to sustain outward journeys. The survival of Homo sapiens during these centuries was not guaranteed. It was precarious. Archaeological traces within Africa show how populations adapted by moving internally rather than outward. In southern Africa, sites reveal shifts in toolkits and subsistence strategies as climates oscillated. In East Africa, human groups followed shifting lakeshores and rivers, exploiting fish when big game was scarce. These adjustments highlight resilience, but they also show constraint. Our ancestors survived by staying close to resources they could trust. To gamble on distant lands was often to gamble on death. We should resist the temptation to see this hesitation as failure. To stay put was itself a strategy. The African continent offered enough diversity of habitat to sustain our species through harsh cycles. By remaining within Africa, sapiens preserved its core populations even as Neanderthals and Denisovans dominated Eurasia. The time spent waiting was not wasted. It was a crucible in which our species learned to endure. Still, the record of failed migrations lingers as a reminder of fragility. The Levantine fossils show that we came close to spreading earlier, only to retreat. Arabia's tools show that our ancestors tested the threshold of expansion, only to falter. Each trace is a ghost of a road not taken, a version of humanity that might have seeded the wider world centuries earlier. Why they failed is still debated. Some blame abrupt climate shifts. Others suggest competition with Neanderthals or other hominins. Perhaps small populations simply lacked the numbers to maintain footholds abroad. The truth is likely all of these at once. The image that emerges is not of a triumphant march out of Africa, but of a species paused at the edge, repeatedly trying and failing. This pause shaped who we are. By the time sapiens finally succeeded in leaving around 70,000 years ago, it carried with it the scars of these bottlenecks and the resilience forged in survival. We are the descendants of those who endured not because they always advanced, but because they sometimes retreated. So why did we hesitate before leaving Africa again? Because the world was hostile, because climates shifted too quickly, because populations were small and fragile, but also because staying was safer than going. Our ancestors waited until chance and change aligned to make the great dispersal possible. To look back is to see not a story of destiny, but a story of patience, endurance, and repeated near failure. Humanity was not inevitable, it was contingent, resting on centuries when the safest choice was simply to stay put. Any of the most revealing patterns from this period comes from the Sahara. Today it's a vast desert, but in the deep past it transformed again and again into a green corridor. Every so often the monsoon rains shifted north, filling basins with lakes and rivers, covering the desert floor with grassland. Satellite images reveal the faint outlines of these ancient waterways, now buried under sand. During these green phases, the Sahara was not a barrier but a bridge, alive with antelope, hippos and fish. For human groups, it must have looked like a highway northward, opening routes into the Levant and beyond. But these windows never stayed open for long. A few thousand years later, the rains retreated, lakes dried, and the green Sahara snapped shut, stranding or erasing populations that had ventured too far. The rhythm was not one of steady expansion, but of pulses, advances in wet times, retreats in dry ones. Arabia tells a similar story. Excavations at sites like Al-Wusta in Saudi Arabia have uncovered stone tools scattered along the shores of ancient lakes. These lakes are long gone, evaporated under today's desert sun, but in their time they provided oases where humans and animals congregated. Fossils of hippos and elephants found alongside stone artifacts show that the environment was lush enough to support large game. For a while, Arabia was a land of opportunity, but like the Sahara, its promise was temporary. As climate shifted, lakes shrank and the corridor closed. Populations that had moved into Arabia during wet periods likely dwindled when the rains failed, either retreating back into Africa or vanishing altogether. These cycles of opening and closing teach us something important about human migration. It was not a single leap, but a stuttered rhythm dictated by climate more than by ambition. Our ancestors could not simply decide to leave Africa at will. They were at the mercy of rainfall and vegetation, tethered to water and prey. Each time the land invited them forward, they tested the boundary. Each time the land turned hostile, they withdrew. This explains why the genetic record shows bottlenecks and low diversity in early sapiens. Populations expanded during green phases, then crashed when aridity returned. Survival meant clinging to refuges along rivers, coasts, or highlands where water persisted. The hesitation to leave Africa was not caution in the modern sense, it was necessity, imposed by landscapes that alternately welcomed and rejected. From the vantage point of today, it can feel as though the Great Dispersal was inevitable, that humanity was always destined to cover the globe. But the evidence from the Sahara and Arabia shows how easily that dispersal could have been delayed indefinitely. If rains had not shifted again around 70,000 years ago, if windows had not reopened, we might still be confined to the African continent. Our long pause before leaving was not a failure of will. It was a reminder that survival often means waiting, adapting, and enduring until conditions finally align. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species had lingered in Africa, advancing and retreating in rhythm with the climate. Small groups ventured into the Levant and Arabia, only to fade back or vanish when the rains failed. Then, somewhere between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, something changed. One of those migrations, instead of collapsing, persisted. From a small population, perhaps no more than a few tens of thousands, Homo sapiens expanded across Asia, Australia, and eventually the globe. It was not the first attempt, but it was the first to succeed. The question is why? What made this expansion different from the others? Genetics offers one clue. Studies of modern DNA show signs of a bottleneck during this period, a contraction of our species to a relatively small breeding population. The reasons for the bottleneck remain debated: climate stress, disease, or perhaps simple chance. Whatever the cause, the result was that the surviving population carried only a fraction of the genetic variation of earlier humans. This means that the ancestors of nearly everyone alive today can be traced back to this small group. A single expansion, born of scarcity, seeded the planet. The success of this migration may owe something to the very fact of its narrow base. Small mobile groups can adapt and spread quickly, exploiting new environments without being tied to large vulnerable centres. Archaeology provides another set of answers. Around this time, we begin to see evidence of technological shifts that may have given sapiens an edge. Earlier humans had relied on thrusting spears, deadly at close range but dangerous to use against large game. By 60,000 years ago, our species was developing projectile weapons, lighter spears that could be thrown, and later, bows and arrows. These allowed hunters to strike from a distance, reducing risk and expanding the range of prey. The advantage of distance may seem small, but in environments filled with massive herbivores and predators, it was decisive. It allowed humans to survive encounters that might have killed others. Behavioural changes are harder to trace but equally significant. Archaeological sites in Africa from around this time show signs of increasing planning and complexity. Shell beads from 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 Cave in South Africa suggest personal adornment. Microscopic residues on tools show that early humans combined materials to create composite implements, hafting stone blades onto shafts with resin and fibre. Heat-treated stone reveals knowledge of controlled fire beyond simple cooking. These innovations reflect not just intelligence but shared knowledge, passed down and refined. They mark a shift toward cultural continuity, where skills accumulated across generations rather than being reinvented. The landscapes of Africa may also have played a role in preparing our ancestors. Populations that endured the swings of drought and abundance across the continent had learned flexibility. They knew how to exploit coastal resources when inland prey vanished, how to dig for roots when rains failed, how to trap fish when herds moved away. This versatility meant that when they crossed into Arabia or beyond, they carried strategies suited to unpredictability. Where earlier migrants may have faltered at the first drought, these humans could adapt and endure. But success was not inevitable. Other hominins still occupied much of Eurasia. Neanderthals dominated Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans held the East. Even remnants of Homo erectus persisted in places. Our ancestors did not expand into an empty world. They entered a landscape already claimed. Their survival depended on interactions with these cousins, sometimes hostile, sometimes intimate. Encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans left marks in our DNA, evidence of interbreeding. But the larger story is that sapiens endured alongside them until only sapiens remained. The reasons are complex and not fully understood, but behavioural flexibility and technological adaptation likely played a role. What set this expansion apart, then, was not a single invention or moment, but a convergence of factors. A small, resilient population honed by bottlenecks, new technologies that reduced risk in hunting and survival, cultural traditions that preserved and transmitted knowledge, ecological flexibility born of a volatile African homeland. These elements combined to tip the balance in favour of endurance rather than retreat. It is tempting to tell the story as triumph, as if our ancestors marched forward with destiny at their side, but the evidence cautions against such certainty. This expansion could easily have failed like the others. A shift in rainfall, a series of epidemics, or a stroke of bad luck might have erased it. That it succeeded is as much contingency as inevitability. We are here because chance allowed one small population to persist long enough to scatter across continents. To look back at this moment is to see the fragility beneath our global presence. We were not an unstoppable force, but a precarious one, barely surviving through long centuries of bottleneck and retreat. What changed around 70,000 years ago was not destiny, but a series of alignments, tools sharper, strategies broader, minds more flexible, groups more cohesive. In that narrow window, the improbable became possible, and a species confined to Africa for hundreds of thousands of years finally stepped out for good. So why did this migration succeed where others failed? Because timing, technology, and resilience converged. Because a small group carried the memory of survival through drought and hunger, and turned that memory into adaptability. Because the tools in their hands extended their reach, and the knowledge in their minds extended their endurance. Success was not guaranteed. It was earned, not through superiority, but through survival in the face of constant risk. The final expansion was not the beginning of human dominance. It was simply the moment when one fragile lineage broke free of its cradle and walked into a wider, uncertain world. When Homo sapiens left Africa for good around 70,000 years ago, the world they entered was not empty, it was inhabited. Europe was Neanderthal country, stretching from the Atlantic to Western Asia. Denisovans roamed the east, their range vast though still only dimly understood. Even Homo floresiensis survived on their island in Indonesia. For tens of thousands of years after our expansion began, we were not alone. We walked into landscapes already claimed by cousins who had lived there for hundreds of millennia. The story of these meetings is often told as a clash, a replacement, a killing. But the evidence complicates that picture. For 20,000 years, from 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, sapiens and other humans overlapped. The encounters were intimate, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, sometimes sexual. If we imagine that we killed them immediately, we miss the ambiguity of coexistence. Genetic evidence provides one of the clearest windows into these encounters. When the Neanderthal genome was first sequenced in the early 21st century, scientists were astonished to discover that non-African populations today carry 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA. This means interbreeding occurred, and not in a single event but repeatedly, across different times and regions. Later, Denisovan DNA was identified in living people from Asia and Oceania, sometimes in amounts greater than 5%. These traces show that our ancestors did not simply exterminate the others, they mixed with them, leaving legacies still carried in our blood. But interbreeding is not the whole story. Archaeological sites show that Neanderthals and sapiens shared landscapes for thousands of years. In the Levant, caves like Kabara and School hold alternating layers of Neanderthal and sapiens occupation, as if the same shelters were used by different groups at different times. In Europe, tools and ornaments found at sites like Châteauperonian levels suggest possible cultural exchange, or at least parallel development. These overlaps lasted long enough that encounters must have been frequent. To imagine that sapiens and Neanderthals never saw each other, never competed for the same prey or territory, is impossible. They met. What happened in those meetings is less clear. Violence is one possibility. Bones of Neanderthals show signs of trauma consistent with conflict, though interpreting causes is difficult. Hunting accidents, falls, and interpersonal violence blur together in the fossil record. Still, competition for territory and resources between two intelligent predators must have been tense. Yet if violence had been the only mode of encounter, interbreeding would not have occurred. Some meetings must have ended in alliance, in exchange, in mating. Even if relationships were unequal, even if coercion played a role, the genetic legacy shows that boundaries between species were porous. Denisovans add further complexity. Fossils are scarce, limited mostly to a cave in Siberia and a jawbone in Tibet, but DNA tells us that sapiens interbred with Denisovans multiple times. The inheritance of genes linked to altitude adaptation in Tibetans shows that these encounters were not just accidents, but exchanges with lasting consequences. In this sense, Denisovans live on in us not only as fragments of DNA, but as functional adaptations, helping humans survive in environments they may never have reached without that legacy. For 2 decades, researchers have debated why Neanderthals and Denisovans eventually disappeared while sapiens endured. Some suggest competition for resources tilted in our favour, perhaps due to projectile weapons or broader diets. Others emphasise population size. Sapiens may have had larger, more connected groups that could absorb losses and spread knowledge faster. Still, others point to climate instability, arguing that Neanderthals were too specialised to cope with sudden shifts. The truth is, likely all of these combined, plus the role of chance. Extinction is not always the result of being weaker, it can be the result of being unlucky. What the encounters teach us is that our survival was not a story of inevitability. It was one outcome among many possible ones. If Neanderthals had persisted longer, if Denisovans had been more numerous, the human world might today be plural rather than singular. We might be one species among several, sharing continents with cousins who are not quite us but not entirely different either. That this did not happen is not proof of our superiority. It is the silence left by their absence. The fossils that remain carry both intimacy and distance. A Denisova cave, a fragment of bone, turned out to belong to a girl with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, a direct hybrid, a single individual whose parents came from 2 different human species. She lived around 90,000 years ago, proof that mixing was not rare but part of lived experience. To imagine her life is to collapse the myth of separation. These were not abstract populations, but individuals who met, who raised children together, who blurred the lines we draw so firmly today. At the same time, we must resist romanticizing these encounters. Coexistence was not peace. The overlap between sapiens and Neanderthals ended with the latter's disappearance around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans, too, faded, their line surviving only as fragments in our genomes. The meetings that once filled caves and valleys with diversity ended in silence. What was once a world of many humankinds became a world of one. So did we kill them immediately, or did we? The answer is neither. We lived beside them, sometimes fought them, sometimes loved them, sometimes absorbed them. For 20,000 years the world was shared. Then, gradually, it was not. To tell the story only as conquest erases intimacy. To tell it only as cooperation erases extinction. The truth lies in the tension between the two. Encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans were not a single event but a long coexistence, full of ambiguity. Their traces remain in our blood, in our bones, in the empty spaces where their voices no longer sound. Tuuli disappeared while sapiens endured. Some suggest competition for resources tilted in our favour, perhaps due to projectile weapons or broader diets. Others emphasise population size. Sapiens may have had larger, more connected groups that could absorb losses and spread knowledge faster. Still others point to climate instability. arguing that Neanderthals were too specialised to cope with sudden shifts. The truth is likely all of these combined, plus the role of chance. Extinction is not always the result of being weaker. It can be the result of being unlucky. Between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, Europe was not a welcoming land. Glaciers pressed southward, carving mountains, spreading ice sheets over the north. Winters stretched long, summers brief. Forests retreated, leaving open steppe tundra dotted with mammoth, bison and reindeer. For an ape born in Africa, the gamble of entering this world was enormous. Yet Homo sapiens did it, pushing into Ice Age Europe and surviving there for tens of thousands of years. It is worth asking why. Why did we thrive in such a brutal climate while our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, never left the tropics of Africa? The answer lies in adaptation, not only of bodies, but of strategies, societies, and ways of seeing the world. Chimpanzees remain bound to tropical forests, where fruit, leaves, and small animals sustain them. Their survival depends on ecosystems that do not freeze. Homo sapiens, by contrast, had already learned flexibility in Africa, where climate shifted between savanna and desert, forest and grassland. This flexibility translated into the ability to face cold environments. One key was mobility. Our ancestors in Ice Age Europe were not fixed in place. They moved with the seasons, following herds of reindeer and horse, shifting camps as resources changed. Archaeological sites reveal temporary shelters, hearths and tool debris, suggesting frequent relocation. Unlike chimpanzees, who build nests nightly within familiar ranges, humans created portable worlds, carrying fire, tools and social bonds across vast landscapes. Fire was crucial. In an environment where winter nights plunged below freezing, fire meant survival. Hearths at sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic show organised use of fire not only for warmth, but for cooking and tool-making. Bones of mammoth and reindeer burned alongside flint flakes speak to camps where families huddled against the cold. Fire extended the day, lit the dark, and allowed humans to endure nights that would have killed unadapted apes. More than warmth, fire symbolised control over an environment that seemed otherwise uncontrollable. Clothing, too, played a decisive role. We do not have direct remains of Ice Age garments, but bone awls and needles suggest the crafting of tailored hides. Animal bones with cut marks at joint surfaces reveal systematic skinning. Furs of reindeer, fox and mammoth could be stitched together to create layered clothing. Unlike chimpanzees, whose bare skin confines them to warmth, humans learned to wear other species as insulation. Each stitch was survival, each hide a barrier against death. This technological leap allowed Homo sapiens to extend into environments no other primate could tolerate. Cooperation magnified these strategies. To hunt mammoth or bison on the steppe required coordination. Spears thrown in unison, groups driving animals into traps, shared butchery and storage. All these required planning and trust. Sites in Central Europe show mass kill events where entire herds were taken, a feat impossible for solitary hunters. The meat, fat, and hides from such hunts sustained groups through lean months. Without cooperation, survival in Ice Age Europe would have been impossible. Chimps cooperate in hunts of monkeys, but at small scales. Humans extended cooperation to an unprecedented degree, transforming it into a foundation of resilience. Mobility, fire, clothing and cooperation were not separate but intertwined. Together they created a strategy that allowed sapiens to gamble on Ice Age Europe and win. The evidence of their success is written in the density of archaeological sites from France to Russia, in the stone tools scattered across steppe plains, in the bones of mammoth carved and burned. For 30,000 years our species endured glacial winters that would have annihilated less adaptable apes. The cost of this gamble was high. Infant mortality must have been severe. Frostbite, starvation and disease haunted camps. Populations remained small, measured in thousands, not millions. Genetic studies suggest repeated bottlenecks, reminders that survival was never guaranteed. Yet somehow, through cycles of cold and brief warmth, sapiens held on. Each generation adapted anew, inheriting not only genes but knowledge of how to skin a reindeer, how to light a fire in wind, how to read the movements of herds. This inheritance of skill was as vital as any biological adaptation. So why did we thrive while chimpanzees never left Africa? Not because we were stronger, but because we were flexible. Chimpanzees remained tied to narrow ecological niches. Homo sapiens broke the tie. We learned to manufacture warmth, to create mobility, to extend social trust beyond immediate kin. These were not inevitable traits. They were hard-won strategies, hammered out in the cold of Ice Age Europe. That we succeeded does not mean we were destined to. It means we gambled and survived long enough to tell the tale. The Ice Age was not conquered, it was endured. And in enduring, our species transformed itself into something no primate had ever been, a creature able to make almost any environment its home. The cold gamble of 50,000 to 20,000 years ago was not just about Europe. It was about proving to nature and to ourselves that we could survive even where no ape should. The legacy of that gamble is the human world itself, stretched from equator to pole, still carrying the memory of firelit shelters under glacial skies. Archaeological sites scattered across Ice Age Europe give texture to this story of adaptation. At Dolní Věstonice in today's Czech Republic, remains from about 25,000 years ago reveal camps built among the bones of mammoths. Circular structures of tusks and ribs, covered likely with hides, formed shelters against the wind. Hearths inside these structures show that families cooked, slept, and worked within walls made of giants. Here, survival was not only about using resources, but about ingenuity in transforming death into architecture. Farther east at Kostenki on the Russian plain, layers of occupation stretch back tens of thousands of years. Generations return to the same river terraces, building fires, shaping stone tools, and hunting the same herds. The persistence of settlement through fluctuating climates suggests deep familiarity with the land, as if people had mapped the cycles of animals and seasons into cultural memory. At Kostenki, we see not wanderers stumbling through the cold but seasoned populations who knew where to be and when, passing knowledge through oral tradition. The tools found at these sites underscore adaptation to harsh environments. Long blades struck from prepared cores allowed for efficient use of scarce stone, producing cutting edges that could be hafted onto spears or knives. Bone awls and needles with carefully drilled eyes speak of tailored garments, far more effective than simple wrapped hides. The presence of these artifacts together shows how survival was not a matter of single inventions, but of whole toolkits evolving to meet the demands of cold climates. We can also trace the rhythms of mobility. Camps were temporary, often dismantled when herds moved, but the recurrence of sites across millennia shows that humans created a seasonal map of Europe. In spring, reindeer were intercepted along migration routes. In summer, salmon runs along rivers provided food in bulk. In winter, mammoth hunts or stored fat carried groups through lean months. Unlike chimps tethered to fruiting trees, humans tethered themselves to cycles of landscape on a continental scale. Even in this utilitarian context, signs of symbolic thought flicker at the edges, though we must be cautious. At Dolní Věstonice, a small clay figurine of an animal was found, fired in a hearth. It may have been a toy, a ritual object, or simply a failed experiment in heating clay. Whatever its purpose, it shows curiosity extended beyond immediate survival. To create such an object in the midst of glacial hardship suggests that humans sought meaning, or perhaps comfort, alongside warmth and food. These case studies remind us that the cold gamble was not a single leap, but thousands of local experiments. Each valley, riverbank and plain carried its own strategy, its own lessons in how to endure. Some failed, some persisted, but together they formed the patchwork of survival that carried sapiens through Europe's Ice Age. The gamble was won not by destiny, but by ingenuity multiplied across generations, stitched into clothes, lit in hearths, and carried in memory. When we think about the story of human expansion, it is tempting to imagine that our closest relatives might have followed us. After all, chimpanzees share with us a common ancestor only a few million years back. If we could spread across the world, why not them? Yet their story remained tied to Africa, their range confined to the equatorial belt of forests and savanna woodlands. From 50,000 years ago to today, chimpanzees never ventured into Europe's frozen plains, never crossed deserts, never adapted to the tundra or the steppes. The contrast is striking. We became global, they remained local. The question is not one of superiority, but of ecology. Why did chimps stay behind when we left? The answer begins with habitat. Chimpanzees are forest apes, dependent on dense canopies for food, nesting and shelter. Their diet revolves around fruit, leaves and occasional meat from small animals. Forests provide not only food but also safety from predators and the microclimate that supports their physiology. Outside these forests, survival becomes precarious. In open savannas, chimps are exposed to heat and cold, to predators like lions and leopards, and to food shortages. Unlike humans, they never developed the cultural tools to buffer against scarcity. Fire, clothing and mobile shelters allowed us to expand into hostile regions. Chimps, bound to the immediate environment, could not. The Ice Age magnified this divide. 50,000 years ago, vast stretches of Africa experienced arid pulses that shrank rainforests into refugia, small, isolated pockets where moisture remained. Chimpanzees survived by clinging to these green islands, adapting their behaviour to exploit whatever resources remained. They showed remarkable flexibility within forests, using tools to crack nuts, fishing termites from mounds, even hunting colobus monkeys cooperatively. But when the forest contracted, they retreated with them. Unlike humans, they did not cross deserts or adapt to grasslands. Their survival strategy was to endure locally, not to expand globally. Predator-prey dynamics also shaped their limits. Chimps faced constant threats from leopards, crocodiles, and eagles. Their defense was group vigilance, alarm calls, and sometimes violent retaliation. But these strategies required dense habitats where ambushes could be seen and escapes were possible. Open landscapes stripped away those advantages. Humans solved this problem differently, through weapons that extended reach, through fire that repelled predators, through cooperation in groups that spanned wide territories. Where chimps saw only risk, humans manufactured safety. That difference marked the boundary of ranges. We should also consider physiology. Chimps are quadrupeds with limited endurance on the ground. They can walk upright briefly but are not adapted for long-distance travel. Their strength is immense at close quarters, but their energy system is designed for bursts, not persistence. Humans evolved a very different physiology. Long legs, sweat glands, efficient cooling through the skin. These traits made us endurance hunters, able to track prey for hours under the sun. Chimps could not match this. Even if forests had opened a corridor northward, their bodies would not have carried them far. They were specialists. We were generalists. Over time, these constraints froze chimpanzees in place. Their range remained within equatorial Africa, expanding and contracting with the forests. Fossil and genetic evidence suggests that populations split into regional groups: western, central and eastern chimps, as well as bonobos south of the Congo River. Each lineage developed its own behaviours, its own tool traditions, its own dialects of calls, but none of them left the continent. They radiated across Africa's forests, but never beyond. Meanwhile, humans moved into environments where no ape had ever lived. Europe, Siberia, Australia, landscapes of ice, desert, and sea crossing. Chimps did not follow, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their survival strategy was tied to a niche. Intelligence alone does not ensure expansion. It must be coupled with the ability to buffer against hostile climates and predators, to transform environments rather than be constrained by them. That transformation was our path, but not theirs. Even today, the range of chimpanzees reflects this history. From Guinea to Uganda, from Cameroon to the forests of the Congo, they persist in the last great belts of tropical woodland. Their numbers have shrunk with human expansion, but their ecological limits remain the same. They did not fail to leave Africa. They did not even try. For chimps, survival meant staying within the environments that had sustained them for millions of years. Their continuity is not failure, but testament to the power of ecological specialization. The contrast with us is sobering. Our expansion scattered us across the globe, but at great cost. We endured bottlenecks, extinctions of cousins, and the constant gamble of survival in hostile climates. Chimps, by staying within forests, avoided those gambles. Their lineage persisted alongside ours, not global but local, not dominant but enduring. In that sense, their story is not one of loss, but of resilience within constraint. So why did chimps never follow us out of Africa? Because their world was not ours. They were tied to forests, to fruits, to the dynamics of predator and prey under dense canopies. We broke those ties, learning to live in deserts, tundras and plains. Neither path was inevitable. Both were strategies for survival. One led to global expansion. The other led to continuity in a narrower range. To this day, chimpanzees remain in Africa, reminding us that leaving was only one possible choice in the long story of apes. The line between us and chimpanzees is thinner than we often admit. They make tools, they hunt, they wage wars, they share food, they even console the grieving. To spend time watching them is to glimpse much of our own reflection. And yet, for all the similarities, there are things that only we do. The boundary is not always about raw intelligence or strength. It is about behaviours that crossed thresholds chimps never did. These thresholds made us global, made us capable of reshaping environments, and made us the last surviving lineage of the human branch. To understand what sets us apart, we must look not at the things we share with chimps, but at the few things that diverged. Fire is one. Chimps fear it. They approach cautiously, sometimes playing with flames, sometimes watching curiously, but they never master it. Humans did. To control fire was to transform landscapes, diets, and social life. The ability to cook softened food, unlocked calories and shortened digestion. It warmed camps and extended waking hours. It drove predators away and hardened wood into weapons. For chimps, fire is spectacle. For us, it became a tool and a companion. Once adopted, it was never abandoned. Every human society on Earth carried fire at its centre, and in that circle of the light we stepped into a world no ape had inhabited before. Another threshold was cumulative technology. Chimps use sticks to fish termites or stones to crack nuts, but the tools remain simple and isolated. A chimp tool today is little different from one 50,000 years ago. Human technology, by contrast, is cumulative. Each generation adds to the last, building complexity upon complexity. A hand axe is improved, then hafted, then replaced by blades, which are sharpened further, until the chain of innovation stretches beyond the memory of any one person. This cumulative culture depends on sharing, on imitation, on preserving knowledge across time. It is not that chimps lack intelligence. It is that their knowledge does not snowball. For us it did, and that snowball grew until it reshaped the planet. Language marks another divide. Chimps communicate with calls, gestures, and facial expressions. They can warn of predators, demand food, or signal aggression, but their signals are limited in scope and context. Human language exploded past these bounds. With symbolic words we can speak not just of what is here, but of what is absent, what is past, what is imagined. We can tell stories, pass down myths, and share strategies with those who were not present. Language made it possible to coordinate large hunts, to plan migrations, to store knowledge outside the individual. Without symbolic language, cooperation remains small. With it, cooperation can span tribes, nations, and eventually the world. Large-scale cooperation is perhaps the greatest threshold. Chimps form alliances, but these are fragile and limited to small groups. Human cooperation extends far beyond face-to-face contact. We rally behind shared symbols, flags, religions, myths, laws. We cooperate with strangers because we believe in collective fictions, whether about gods, nations, or money. This ability to create imagined orders allows groups of thousands or millions to act in concert. It is not that chimps lack sociality. It is that their social world is bounded by personal recognition. Ours is bounded only by imagination. Each of these thresholds, fire, cumulative technology, language, and large-scale cooperation, was not inevitable. They emerged gradually, shaped by climate, by chance, by necessity. There were long periods when human ancestors carried fire but did not speak symbolically, when they made tools but did not accumulate them, when cooperation was limited to small bands. The leap was not sudden. It was the slow crossing of thresholds that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Fire once mastered is never abandoned. A cumulative culture once established grows relentlessly. Symbolic language once spoken cannot be unspoken, and large-scale cooperation, once possible, expands until it redefines the human world. Why did chimps never cross these thresholds? It is not because they are incapable of thought, it is because their survival did not require it. In their forests, fruit and foliage are abundant. Predators can be managed by vigilance and strength. Small group cooperation suffices. They are specialists in a niche that rewarded stability, not transformation. Humans, by contrast, were forced into instability. Climate swings, savanna expansions, desert bottlenecks, each demanded adaptation. To survive, we reached beyond immediate needs, stacking innovations, inventing symbols, forging bonds beyond kin. Chimps did not need these things, and so they remained forest apes. We needed them, and so we became something else. These thresholds did not make us superior in any absolute sense. They made us different. They allowed us to leave Africa, to endure ice ages, to populate islands and mountains, to shape fire and stone into engines of survival. But they also bound us to paths chimps never had to walk, paths of dependence on culture, on symbols, on systems so vast that no individual can comprehend them. Where chimps remain grounded in the immediate, we are tethered to abstractions. In this sense, the things only we do are both our strength and our burden. So what are the behaviours chimps never crossed into? Fire that became home, technology that accumulated beyond memory, language that conjured absent worlds, cooperation that built societies of strangers. These are not trivial differences. They are the pillars of our survival. They are the reasons we expanded while chimps remained in Africa. They are the boundaries that mark our divergence. And they remind us that being human is not about intelligence in isolation, but about thresholds crossed, choices made, and paths taken that led us into a world no other ape has entered. Archaeological sites across Africa and Eurasia give us glimpses of these thresholds in motion. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓 in Israel, 500,000 years ago, layers of burned flint and charred seeds suggest that hominins were not just encountering fire but tending it, returning again and again to hearths. The traces are small, but they mark the difference between fearing fire and folding it into daily life. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓 in South Africa, microscopic ash particles embedded deep within sediments tell a similar story, pushing controlled fire back to nearly 1 million years ago. For chimpanzees, fire is still a spectacle. For humans, even in these deep layers, it was already something more. Evidence for cumulative technology appears in the refinement of stone industries. Early hand axes, while impressive, changed little for hundreds of thousands of years, but around 300,000 years ago, Middle Stone Age sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓 in South Africa show prepared core techniques, where stone was carefully shaped before flakes were struck, allowing for standardization and efficiency. Later, at Howisson's Port, backed blades and microliths suggest tools designed to be parts of composite weapons. Each improvement built on the last, forming a chain of memory impossible without cultural continuity. Chimps crack nuts with stone, but their grandchildren crack nuts the same way. Humans struck stone in new ways, and their grandchildren struck it differently still. Language leaves fewer fossils, but hints appear in symbolic objects. At Blombos Cave 75,000 years ago, pieces of ochre were engraved with cross-hatched patterns. The meaning is lost to us, but the act of engraving abstract designs suggests that humans were communicating ideas not tied to immediate survival. Symbolism is the shadow of language. Where chimps gesture to warn of danger, these marks whisper of concepts carried beyond the here and now. Large-scale cooperation is visible in the sheer size of some Paleolithic kill sites. At La Côte de Saint-Prelade on Jersey, the remains of mammoths and woolly rhinos pile in heaps, suggesting coordinated drives off cliffs. No single hunter, no small alliance could have orchestrated such feats. They required trust among dozens, perhaps more, united by shared strategies and shared belief that the group would divide the spoils. Chimps can cooperate to hunt a monkey, but the scale stops there. Humans organise to bring down giants. These examples remind us that the things only we do were not magic leaps but accumulations. Fire tended in caves, stones shaped in new ways, ochre etched with lines, animals herded off cliffs, each step small, each echoing forward. Together they created behaviours that chimps never crossed into, not because chimps were lesser, but because their worlds did not demand it. Our world did, and so we learned to do the things only we do. When scientists first compared the human and chimpanzee genomes in the early 21st century, the result was both shocking and humbling. The two sequences matched with about 98 to 99% similarity. On paper, we are almost identical, yet the outcomes of that small fraction of difference are enormous. One lineage created symphonies, space probes, and nuclear weapons. The other remained bound to forests and savannas. How can so small a genetic gap produce such divergent realities? The answer lies not in raw similarity, but in where the differences cluster, how genes are regulated, and how small tweaks cascade into profound consequences. One of the most famous examples is 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, a gene linked to speech and language. Both humans and chimpanzees carry 𝐓𝐹XP2, but the human version contains 2 amino acid changes that arose after our lineages split. These changes altered how the gene regulates neural circuits involved in motor control and vocalization. Mutations in 𝐹OXP2 in humans today cause severe speech deficits, showing its importance in language. In chimps, the ancestral version supports vocalizations and communication, but it does not enable the fine motor control of the tongue and lips needed for speech. The difference is minute at the molecular level, yet transformative in behaviour. Another striking region is HAR1, the Human Accelerated Region 1. This stretch of DNA shows rapid change in humans compared to chimps, despite being highly conserved across other vertebrates. HAR1 is active during brain development, particularly in the neocortex, where complex thought, planning, and abstract reasoning emerge. The exact function remains under study, but the rapid divergence suggests strong evolutionary pressure. A few dozen base pair changes in HAR1 may have helped rewire brain development, contributing to the expanded and reorganized cortex that underlies human cognition. Chromosomal differences also tell part of the story. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, while chimpanzees have 24. The discrepancy arises from a fusion. Human chromosome 2 is the result of 2 ancestral ape chromosomes joining end to end. This fusion left behind telltale remnants of telomeres and centromeres in the middle of the chromosome. On its own, the fusion did not create civilization, but it represents a structural rearrangement that may have influenced reproductive isolation, marking one of the many genomic quirks that accumulate in lineages. Perhaps the most important insight from genomics is that the differences between us and chimps are less about the presence or absence of genes, and more about regulation. When genes switch on, where they switch on, and for how long. Humans and chimps share most protein-coding genes, but the timing of their activity diverges. During brain development, human genes tend to remain active longer, extending growth periods and allowing for larger, more complex structures. Differences in gene regulation also influence jaw development, hair growth, immune response, and metabolism. In many cases, the genes themselves are identical. It is the conductors, the switches, and the rhythms that diverge. Comparative genomics has revealed that humans carry unique deletions and duplications not found in chimps. Some of these affect genes related to neuronal development and synaptic plasticity, hinting at pathways to cognition. Others involve immune defences, reflecting the constant arms race with pathogens. These structural variations are subtle, but evolution often works through subtlety, fine-tuning systems rather than reinventing them. The genome also reminds us of shared vulnerability. Humans and chimps both carry ancient retroviruses embedded in their DNA, relics of infections suffered by common ancestors. These viral fossils tie us together in ways as profound as our differences divide us. The genome is not a record of triumph alone, but of shared history, disease, and struggle. How close are we really to a chimp? Closer than the surface suggests. A small fraction of difference, scattered across regulatory switches and developmental timing, accounts for much of the divergence. The genome tells us that we're not a separate creation, but a variation on an ancient theme, tuned slightly differently. The great paradox is that 98% similarity can produce worlds apart. In this light, the genome humbles us. It shows that humanity's uniqueness is not written in vast genetic chasms, but in tiny shifts. A couple of amino acids in 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, dozens of substitutions in 𝐓AR1, a chromosome fused where others remain separate, thousands of regulatory tweaks in when and where genes switch on. Evolution does not need dramatic rewrites to produce dramatic outcomes. It needs only small edits repeated over time. So where are the key differences? They lie in speech genes, in brain development regulators, in chromosome structure, in the choreography of genetic switches. They are subtle, cumulative, and easily overlooked. Yet they define the boundary between a lineage that builds rockets and a lineage that cracks nuts. To peer inside the genome is to see the narrowness of the gulf and the immensity of what flowed through it. There is a persistent image in popular imagination that chimpanzees are somehow living fossils, preserved exactly as they were millions of years ago. When people ask, why didn't chimps become human? Hidden inside that question is the idea that chimps are stuck, that evolution carried us forward but left them behind. The truth is far less tidy. Chimps are not frozen in time, they're changing, adapting, evolving still. To watch them today is not to glimpse our past unaltered, but to see another lineage navigating its own present, under its own pressures, with its own future unfolding. One of the clearest signs of chimpanzee evolution is culture. For decades, researchers like Jane Goodall, Christophe Buch and others have documented traditions in chimpanzee groups that vary from region to region. Some chimps crack nuts with stone hammers, others never do, even when the nuts and stones are available. Some groups fish termites with sticks, others with leaf stems, others not at all. Grooming rituals differ, hunting styles differ, even the calls they use differ in subtle ways. These are not frozen instincts. They are behaviours passed on through social learning, maintained by imitation and teaching. Culture in chimps is fluid, spreading or disappearing as individuals innovate or groups fragment. That fluidity is evolution in action, not stasis. Ecological pressures also drive change. As forests shrink across Africa, chimpanzees are adapting to new habitats. In West Africa, some groups forage in croplands, raiding maize or banana fields, risking conflict with humans. In savanna edge populations, chimps have been observed ranging farther, tolerating hotter, drier conditions than their forest-dwelling cousins. They hunt more often, diversify their diets, and in some cases use tools in novel ways to access scarce resources. These shifts show that chimps are flexible, not fixed. When the environment changes, they respond, just as our ancestors once did. Genetics confirms that chimpanzees are evolving. Studies of populations across Africa reveal ongoing divergence. Western, Central and Eastern chimps carry distinct genetic signatures, shaped by isolation and local adaptation. Bonobos, south of the Congo River, represent another branch altogether, with their own social systems and ecological strategies. Within each of these groups, natural selection continues to act. Resistance to pathogens, tolerance to climates, reproductive patterns, all are subject to the same evolutionary forces that shape every living species, including us. Even social behaviours evolve. Bonobos, for instance, developed a suite of traits very different from common chimps. More female alliances, less lethal aggression, more sexual bonding. These are not echoes of the past, but unique responses to ecological and demographic pressures south of a great river barrier. To see bonobos as unchanged is to miss their innovation. Evolution did not stop with them any more than it stopped with us. The myth of chimps as frozen in time often arises from the way we use them as stand-ins for our ancestors. Because chimps are our closest relatives, we look at them and imagine what we once were. But this is misleading. Chimps today are not living fossils. They are as modern as we are, separated from our last common ancestor by the same 6 or 7 million years of independent evolution. To assume they are unchanged is to erase their story. The pressures on chimpanzees today are, however, harsher than at almost any point in their evolutionary history. Human expansion has fragmented forests, brought disease, and increased conflict. Viruses like Ebola have devastated populations. Habitat loss, forces chimps into closer contact with humans, where snares, hunting, and deforestation reduce their numbers. These pressures are not static backdrops. They are selective forces. Chimps that survive in a human-dominated landscape will carry forward traits, behaviours, and perhaps even genes that differ from those that perished. Evolution is ongoing, though it is often tragic when the main driver is human destruction. But even in the shadow of these threats, chimps continue to surprise us with invention. Some groups have been observed using spears to hunt bush babies, sharpening sticks with their teeth and thrusting them into tree hollows. Others use moss sponges to collect water. Still others pound on tree trunks to produce drumming sounds that carry through the forest, perhaps as a form of communication. These are not echoes of an ancient world, but responses to a modern one. They show that the boundary between human culture and chimp culture is not one of stasis versus dynamism, but of degree. So why do we imagine chimps as frozen in time? Perhaps because it comforts us to believe evolution built a ladder, and we stand at the top. But ladders are myths. Evolution is a tree, and chimps are another branch still growing, still adapting, still alive with change. They are not our past. They are our present-day cousins, with their own unfolding future. When we look at chimps today, we should not ask why they did not become human. We should ask how they are becoming themselves, in landscapes that shift under their feet, in cultures that pass from hand to hand, in genes that respond to pressure as ours do. Evolution did not stop with us, and it did not stop with them. It never stops. The story of chimps is still being written, line by line, in forests that shrink and in behaviours that expand. To call them frozen is to miss the movement. To see them as evolving is to recognise that they are, like us, always in motion. If we look ahead rather than back, the question becomes not whether chimps are evolving, but how their evolution will be steered by the pressures of the 21st century. Natural selection does not stop when a species enters our gaze. It continues, though the forces now include us. Hunting, disease spillover, deforestation, and climate change all shape which chimps live long enough to reproduce, and which traits may become more common in generations to come. Evolution is not always gradual in such contexts. In fragmented populations, small genetic shifts can accelerate, sometimes leading to rapid divergence or, more often, tragic collapse. We may already be witnessing the emergence of new behavioural strategies that could be the seeds of longer-term evolutionary shifts. In fragmented forest corridors, chimps are learning to navigate farmland, adopting risk-taking behaviours to exploit crops. Such boldness may carry survival advantages in the short term, even as it raises conflicts with humans. If such behaviours persist, future chimp populations could show greater tolerance for disturbed landscapes, selecting for individuals who can adapt quickly to environments dominated by us. There is also the invisible hand of disease. Epidemics like Ebola have wiped out entire groups, leaving behind survivors with resistance that could alter the genetic landscape of regional populations. As climate warms and habitats shift, new pathogens will arrive, selecting again for traits that confer resilience. The chimps who persist in the next century may be genetically distinct from those of today, not because they are frozen relics, but because they are actively adapting to a world we are reshaping around them. This opens an uncomfortable reflection. Human influence is now one of the strongest evolutionary forces acting on chimpanzees. Our deforestation fragments their range, our crops alter their diets, our diseases thin their numbers. We did not intend to become their environment, but we are. Their evolution is not frozen. It is being redirected through us. Some scientists argue that conservation must not only protect current populations, but recognise that chimpanzees will inevitably change as they respond to our presence. In other words, the chimps of the future will not be the chimps of the past, just as we are not the humans of 100,000 years ago. It is tempting to ask what chimps would look like in another million years if they were left undisturbed, allowed to evolve on their own trajectories. But they are not left undisturbed. Their future will be bound with ours, their evolution entangled in human decisions about forests, diseases, and survival. Evolution did not stop for them, but whether it continues through resilience or through extinction depends largely on us. Why do we keep asking if chimpanzees are on their way to becoming human? It is a question that refuses to fade, a question that appears in classrooms, in casual conversations, in the corners of the internet. It is not really a question about chimps at all. It is a question about us. To ask why chimps did not evolve into people is to reveal how deeply we want to see ourselves as the destination of evolution, the inevitable outcome of a climb. Yet that is not what evolution is. It is not a ladder but a branching tree, a ceaseless process of change that has no ultimate goal. Chimps are not on their way to becoming human. They are already fully chimpanzee, as adapted to their worlds as we are to ours. The fact that this misconception persists tells us more about the human mind than about chimpanzees. Part of the reason the question lingers is narrative. We humans crave stories with arcs, with beginnings and ends, with protagonists and conclusions. When we look at the fossil record or at genomes, we cannot resist arranging them into a tale of progress. We imagine our ancestors stumbling upright, then sharpening stones, then painting caves, until at last they become us. It is a tidy story, one that feels satisfying because it puts us at the end. Chimps, in this framing, become the ones who did not finish the climb. They are cast as stuck at an earlier rung. But the reality is stranger. Evolution is not progress. It is adaptation, endless and shifting. We are not the end of the story. We are a branch among many. Another reason the question will not die is pride. To see chimps as unfinished versions of us flatters our sense of uniqueness. It reassures us that we are special, chosen, different in kind rather than in degree. But humility demands another view. Chimps are not failed humans. They are successful chimps. They have persisted through the same climatic shifts and environmental pressures that shaped us. They have cultures of their own, communication systems of their own, strategies of survival honed for millions of years. To look at them and see incompleteness is to misunderstand what evolution produces. It does not produce humans as its goal. It produces diversity, each lineage adapted to its own world. The question also lingers because of anxiety. If chimps are not becoming human, then perhaps we're not becoming anything either. Perhaps we're not a finished product but a moment in a process that continues beyond us. That thought unsettles us. We prefer to believe we are the culmination. Yet the genome, the climate, and the long future of Earth remind us that we too are still evolving. We are not done. The differences that distinguish us from chimps today were once as small and as tentative as the differences that now separate them from us. To imagine chimps as frozen is to deny our own impermanence. Philosophically, the question reveals our difficulty with coexistence. We want chimps to be on their way to us because it is easier than seeing them as a parallel. A parallel means that there is more than one way to be intelligent, more than one way to be social, more than one way to survive. We struggle with that multiplicity. It threatens the story that our way is the best, the final, the only way. Chimps challenge that myth simply by existing. They are our mirror, but not our path. Even in the 21st century, the language of primitive and advanced still slips into discussions, despite decades of scientific correction. We describe tools as primitive, societies as primitive, as if they were early stages on a road to us. Yet chimpanzees remind us that evolution does not rank. It only fits. Their termite sticks are not early versions of our spears. They are solutions to termite problems. Their grooming rituals are not primitive forms of politics. They are politics in chimpanzee form. To place them on a scale beneath us is to misunderstand both them and ourselves. The persistence of the question is also psychological. We want reassurance that we are different, that we are set apart from the animals we resemble most. To think of chimps as future humans comforts that desire. It places a safe distance between them now and us now, as though the gulf were one of time rather than of branching. But the gulf is not time, it is divergence. Chimps and humans have been separate lineages for 6 or 7 million years. They will never become human, because they already became chimpanzee. Perhaps the deeper reason this question will not die is that it disguises another. What does it mean to be human? We ask about chimps because we are unsure of ourselves. If they are so close to us, if they mourn their dead, if they hunt and share and deceive, then what is the boundary? To insist that they are on their way to us is to keep the boundary clean. To accept that they are fully themselves is to face the blur the uncomfortable truth that humanness is not absolute. It is one way of being, among many. In the end, the most humbling perspective is also the truest. Chimps are not failed experiments, not frozen relics, not future humans. They are our cousins, shaped by the same relentless process that shaped us, but along a different path. They remind us that evolution does not aim at us. It aims at nothing. It only unfolds. If we insist on asking why they did not become us, we risk missing the real wonder, that they became themselves, and that we became ourselves, and that both lineages are still changing. So the question will not die, but perhaps we can learn to answer it differently. Not with condescension, but with humility. Not by imagining a ladder, but by remembering the tree. Chimps are not waiting to be human. They are waiting, like us, to see what they will become. And perhaps the hardest truth is that someday, far in the future, we may be gone, and they may remain, or neither of us may endure. Evolution cares nothing for ladders. It only cares for survival in the moment. That, in the end, is what the question really says about us. It reveals our hunger for stories, our pride, our anxieties, our struggle to accept parallel truths. Chimps do not ask why they are not human. Only we ask that. And in asking, we reveal our longing to see purpose where there may be none, to find ourselves at the centre of a story that has no centre. Perhaps the better question is not why chimps are not us, but why we still need them to be. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.